The crushing defeat at the Battle of Ain Jalut forced the Ilkhanate to confront a reality it had never truly faced before. For generations, the Mongols had relied on overwhelming military power, demanding absolute submission from every kingdom that stood in their path. European Christians, Muslim rulers, and anyone else who resisted were presented with the same choice: surrender or be destroyed. But after Ain Jalut, that uncompromising policy no longer seemed enough. Hulagu Khan suddenly found himself fighting on two fronts. While the Mamluks had halted Mongol expansion in Syria, Berka Khan of the Golden Horde was attacking from the north. Instead of concentrating his armies against a single enemy, Hulagu now had to divide his strength. Under these circumstances, defeating the Mamluks through military force alone became increasingly difficult. Faced with this challenge, the Ilkhan began considering a strategy that would have seemed unlikely only a few years earlier. Rather than relying solely on conquest, he explored the possibility of cooperation with the Christian powers of Western Europe. The Mamluks had become a common enemy, and that shared interest offered a rare opportunity for diplomacy between two worlds that had previously viewed each other with deep suspicion. One man who may have encouraged this new direction was a Dominican friar known as David of Ashby. Sent to the Mongol court as part of a papal mission, David remained with Hulagu for several years and gained unusual access to the ruler's inner circle. During his stay, he witnessed part of the Mongol campaign in Syria and even secured the release of Christian captives. His presence gave the Mongols a direct connection to the Latin Christian world at precisely the moment they were reconsidering their foreign policy. By 1262, Hulagu decided to act. He dispatched an embassy toward Western Europe with the intention of opening diplomatic relations, particularly with King Louis IX of France. Political complications prevented the mission from reaching its final destination, but the attempt itself marked a significant turning point. For the first time, the Ilkhanate was actively seeking military cooperation with European rulers instead of demanding their submission. The proposal envisioned a coordinated assault on the Mamluks. While Mongol armies advanced across Syria, European naval forces would control the eastern Mediterranean coastline, preventing Egypt from receiving reinforcements or escaping by sea. It was an ambitious strategy that reflected the Ilkhanate's growing awareness that victory would require allies as well as armies. Yet beneath this friendlier tone, the traditional Mongol worldview had not completely disappeared. Hulagu still portrayed Mongol rule as part of a divine mission established by Genghis Khan. Cooperation was welcome, but the expectation remained that other. Rulers should ultimately recognize the legitimacy of Mongol authority. Diplomacy had softened the language, but it had not entirely replaced the imperial ideology. News of Hulagu's overtures eventually reached Pope Urban IV, who was informed that the Mongol ruler might even be considering conversion to Christianity. Whether this reflected Hulagu's genuine intentions or simply optimistic reports from intermediaries remains uncertain. Nevertheless, the Pope responded positively, expressing hope that baptism could pave the way for closer relations and even military cooperation against the Muslim powers. Despite this encouraging exchange, no formal alliance emerged. Europe remained divided by its own political struggles, particularly the conflict between the papacy and the Hohenstaufen dynasty. Launching another major crusade required unity that simply did not exist. The papacy also appears to have hesitated, preferring clearer evidence of Hulagu's commitment before offering meaningful support. When Hulagu died, his son Abaka inherited both the throne and the diplomatic initiative. Unlike his father, Abaka pursued contacts with Europe repeatedly and with remarkable persistence. He believed that only a coordinated offensive between Mongol and Christian armies could finally break Mamluk power in the Near East. Beginning in the late 1260s, Abaka sent several embassies to the papacy and to European monarchs, including James I of Aragon. His messages proposed carefully coordinated military operations in which Mongol forces, Byzantine armies, and Western Crusaders would strike simultaneously from different directions, trapping the Mamluks between them. Although European rulers showed interest and diplomatic correspondence continued, translating these ambitious plans into military action proved far more difficult. Language barriers, political rivalries, Logistical challenges and changing priorities repeatedly delayed cooperation. King James even attempted to launch a crusading expedition, but storms scattered much of his fleet before it reached the eastern Mediterranean. Only a small contingent eventually arrived in Acre, too weak to influence events. By the end of the decade, the dream of a grand Mongol-Christian alliance remained exactly that, a dream. Diplomatic exchanges had become more frequent, mutual hostility had diminished, and both sides recognized the strategic value of cooperation. Yet, despite years of negotiations, letters, and embassies, the coalition that might have changed the balance of power in the Middle East never materialized. Instead, the Mamluk Sultanate continued to face its enemies one at a time, while the opportunity for a united front gradually slipped away. As the year 1270 approached, many in Europe believed another great crusade was finally about to change the course of the struggle in the Holy Land. Pope Clement IV had spent years encouraging cooperation between the Latin kingdoms and the Ilkhanate, hoping that a simultaneous offensive would crush the Mamluk Sultanate from two directions. On paper, the plan looked promising. In reality, events unfolded very differently. King Louis IX of France did lead a new crusade, but instead of sailing directly towards Syria or Egypt, he chose to attack Tunis in North Africa. The decision surprised many contemporaries and effectively removed any possibility of coordinating operations with the Mongols. Whatever strategic calculations influenced Louis, they placed the crusade far from the battlefield, where an alliance with the Ilkhanate could have mattered most. Even if Louis had landed in the eastern Mediterranean, success was far from guaranteed. Abaka Khan was deeply occupied by conflicts on his eastern frontier, where rival Mongol rulers threatened his own empire. His attention and military resources were divided, making it unlikely that he could have committed the massive army required for a decisive campaign against the Mamluks. Meanwhile, Sultan Baybars closely monitored developments across the Mediterranean. Reports reached Cairo that the French king had launched another crusade, prompting preparations for a possible invasion of Mamluk territory. When later news confirmed that Louis had diverted his expedition to Tunis and eventually died there, the immediate danger disappeared. Once again, the opportunity for a coordinated Mongol Christian offensive slipped away before it had even begun. A more serious attempt at cooperation emerged the following year. Prince Edward of England, the future Edward I, arrived in Acre after taking part in the Tunis expedition. Unlike previous crusaders, Edward immediately sought contact with Abaka, hoping to coordinate military operations against their common enemy. The Ilkhan responded with enthusiasm. He informed Edward that a Mongol force under the command of Samagar would march into northern Syria and urged the English prince to establish a clear timetable so that both armies could strike together. For a brief moment, it seemed that years of diplomatic correspondence might finally produce real military cooperation. In the autumn of 1271, Mongol forces crossed into northern Syria, raiding deep into territories controlled by the Mamluks. Their advance caused alarm throughout the region. Baybars reacted with remarkable speed, gathering reinforcements from Egypt while moving north to confront the invaders. His intelligence network had already warned him that both Mongol and Crusader activity was increasing, allowing him to prepare before either offensive gained momentum. As the Mamluk army approached, the Mongol commanders chose not to risk a major battle. They withdrew before meaningful cooperation with Edward's forces could take place. The carefully discussed alliance never progressed beyond diplomatic promises and limited military movements. Edward nevertheless attempted to exploit Baybars' temporary absence by attacking positions in Palestine. The operation achieved little. Mamluk commanders quickly responded, forcing the English forces back toward Acre before any lasting gains could be secured. Although some contemporary writers suggested that Edward and the Mongols had coordinated their actions, the evidence points instead to parallel campaigns carried out without effective communication or unified planning. Edward's expedition ended in disappointment. After surviving an assassination attempt that left him seriously wounded, he abandoned the Holy Land and returned to England in 1272. His crusade altered neither the strategic balance in Syria nor the growing strength of the Mamluk Sultanate. Despite these setbacks, Abaka did not abandon diplomacy. Several years later, his envoys again appeared in Western Europe, apologizing for the limited support provided during earlier campaigns and expressing hope that future cooperation would be more successful. The message suggested that the Ilkhan still regarded a military alliance with the Latin powers as one of his most important foreign policy objectives. That same diplomatic effort reached an important stage at the Second Council of Lyon in 1274. Representatives from the Ilkhanate appeared before Pope Gregory X, presenting Abaka's desire for closer relations with Latin Christendom. They explained that previous campaigns against the Mamluks had been delayed because the Ilkhanate had been forced to defend itself against rival Mongol states. Those internal conflicts, they claimed, had now largely been resolved, creating an opportunity for renewed action in the Middle East. The Pope welcomed the delegation and viewed the proposal with interest. Gregory remained deeply committed to recovering the Holy Land and hoped that cooperation with the Mongols might strengthen a future crusade. Yet practical obstacles continued to outweigh diplomatic enthusiasm. European rulers were preoccupied with their own political conflicts, financial burdens, and territorial disputes, leaving little appetite for another massive overseas campaign. Although correspondence continued between Abaka, the papacy, and rulers such as Edward I, the promised expedition never materialized. European monarchs responded politely, praised the Ilkhan's favorable attitude toward Christianity, and expressed support in principle, but none committed themselves to launching the large-scale military operation that Abaka had envisioned. Religious diplomacy increasingly replaced military planning. Reports circulated that leading Mongol rulers, including Kublai Khan, were sympathetic to Christianity or even interested in conversion. The papacy eagerly dispatched missionaries to the Mongol world, hoping to strengthen these connections. While these missions expanded cultural and religious contact between East and West, they produced no military alliance. By the end of the 1270s, nearly 2 decades of negotiations had generated an impressive exchange of embassies, letters, and promises. Yet every serious opportunity for cooperation had been undermined by competing wars, political divisions, logistical challenges, or simple bad timing. The long-discussed Mongol Christian coalition remained an unrealized possibility rather than a historical reality. For Baybars and the Mamluk Sultanate, this failure proved enormously significant. Instead of confronting a united enemy advancing simultaneously from Europe and the Ilkhanate, the Mamluks continued to defeat their opponents separately. Diplomacy between East and West had been ambitious, persistent, and sometimes remarkably close to success. But in the end, the alliance existed more in correspondence than on the battlefield. By the early 1270s, the possibility of a combined Mongol and European offensive had become one of the greatest strategic concerns facing the Mamluk Sultanate. Whether such an alliance could actually be organized was uncertain, but the mere possibility forced Sultan Baybars to prepare for his worst-case scenario. According to later Muslim chroniclers, Baybars feared that his enemies might strike from opposite directions at the same time. A crusader fleet could attack Egypt or the Levant from the Mediterranean, while Mongol armies swept into Syria from the east. If that happened, the Mamluk army would be forced to divide its strength across multiple fronts, dramatically reducing its ability to respond. Whether these reports accurately reflect Baybars' own words is impossible to know. What is clear, however, is that later generations remembered him as a ruler who fully understood the danger of fighting both the Franks and the Ilkhanate simultaneously. Even the possibility of such coordination influenced Mamluk strategic planning. Some historians believe this fear helps explain Baybars' relentless campaigns against the remaining Crusader states along the Mediterranean coast. Every fortress that fell into Mamluk hands reduced the likelihood that European armies could establish a secure base for cooperating with the Mongols. Eliminating the Crusader presence was therefore not simply a religious objective, it was also a military necessity. While diplomats discussed alliances and armies prepared for war, merchants followed a very different logic. Across the eastern Mediterranean, commerce often proved stronger than politics. The Italian maritime republics, especially Genoa and Venice, occupied a unique position between the rival powers. Their merchants traded extensively with the Mamluk Sultanate while simultaneously maintaining profitable commercial connections with the Ilkhanate. For them, economic opportunity frequently outweighed political loyalty. Genoese traders played a particularly important role in transporting young slaves from the territories of the Golden Horde to Egypt, where many eventually entered the Mamluk military system. This trade generated enormous profits and became one of the most valuable commercial networks in the Eastern Mediterranean. At the same time, Genoese merchants were also welcomed within Ilkhanid territory, where they established thriving businesses and gained influence at the Mongol court. Venice followed a similar path. Venetian merchants appeared in major Ilkhanid cities while continuing to conduct business with the Mamluks. Even though Venice and Genoa competed fiercely with one another, both republics demonstrated remarkable flexibility when commercial interests were involved. This created an unusual situation. Italian merchants were trading with powers that were actively fighting one another, yet neither side considered these economic relationships important enough to abandon. Profit repeatedly overcame ideological divisions. Even papal attempts to restrict commerce with the Mamluks achieved only limited success. Church authorities discouraged trade in strategic materials that might strengthen Muslim armies, but merchants often ignored these instructions. For many commercial families, protecting lucrative trade routes mattered far more than participating in political or religious conflicts. The diplomatic relationship between the Ilkhanate and Western Europe also evolved over time. During Hulagu's reign, Mongol rulers still approached foreign diplomacy from a position of overwhelming confidence. Cooperation was discussed, but it was often presented as something that European rulers were expected to accept rather than negotiate. Abaka adopted a noticeably different approach. By the late 13th century, the political landscape had changed dramatically. The Mongol Empire had fragmented into separate khanates, repeated wars had weakened the Ilkhanate, and the Mamluks had demonstrated that Mongol armies were not invincible. Under these circumstances, diplomacy increasingly replaced demands for submission. Instead of issuing commands, Abaka addressed European monarchs and popes as potential partners. His letters consistently emphasized shared interests, mutual enemies, and the advantages of coordinated military action. This represented an important shift in Mongol foreign policy. The papacy also adjusted its own expectations. Earlier, popes had often linked military cooperation to the Mongols' conversion to Christianity. Over time, however, this requirement became less rigid. Although church leaders continued encouraging conversion, they increasingly separated religious hopes from practical diplomacy, recognizing that an alliance might still be valuable even if the Ilkhans never embraced the Christian faith. Despite these changes, diplomacy repeatedly failed to produce meaningful military cooperation. Distance alone created enormous difficulties. Messages required months to travel between Europe and the Mongol court. By the time one embassy returned with an answer, political circumstances on both sides had often changed completely. Coordinating armies separated by thousands of kilometers became an extraordinary challenge. European politics created additional obstacles. Kings struggled with wars, financial pressures, dynastic disputes, and rival ambitions much closer to home. Although many rulers expressed sympathy for recovering the Holy Land, few were prepared to commit the enormous resources necessary for another major crusade. The Crusade of 1270 demonstrated these problems perfectly. Louis IX assembled one of the largest crusading forces of the century, yet the expedition never reached the region where cooperation with the Mongols could have made a strategic difference. Instead, the campaign ended in Tunisia, leaving the Mamluks untouched. Abaka himself also missed important opportunities. When Prince Edward requested assistance in 1271, the Ilkhan responded with only a limited military expedition rather than committing the full strength of his army. A larger and more determined offensive might have forced Baybars into an extremely difficult strategic position, especially if combined with renewed crusader operations along the coast. Instead, the Mongol advance remained limited, the crusader attacks were isolated, and the Mamluks successfully prevented either force from gaining a decisive advantage. The closest the Ilkhanate ever came to coordinating military action with Western Europe ended without lasting results. Even so, Abaka never abandoned the idea. Throughout his reign, he repeatedly dispatched embassies to European courts, urging kings and popes to unite against the Mamluk Sultanate. These diplomatic missions reveal just how important the Syrian frontier remained to Ilkhanid strategy. Abaka believed that controlling Syria was essential to securing his western frontier and expanding Mongol influence throughout the eastern Mediterranean. His successors inherited the same ambition. They continued sending envoys, exchanging letters, and proposing military alliances with Christian Europe. Yet despite decades of negotiation, the outcome remained unchanged. The vision of a grand Mongol Christian coalition never moved beyond diplomacy. It remained one of the greatest unrealized alliances of the medieval world, an opportunity discussed for decades but never fully brought to life on the battlefield. In the years immediately following the Battle of Ain Jalut, the conflict between the Mamluk Sultanate and the Ilkhanate settled into a tense and dangerous pattern. Neither side was yet able to launch a decisive war of conquest, but the frontier remained constantly active. Raids crossed the border in both directions. Spies carried information between rival camps, refugees moved from one empire to the other, and regional powers were drawn into a struggle much larger than themselves. Several features came to define this long confrontation. The first was the almost continuous series of incursions, reconnaissance missions, and limited attacks along the Syrian frontier. The second was the involvement of the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia, whose rulers had become committed allies of the Mongols. Their support for the Ilkhanate would eventually bring a devastating Mamluk response. A third development was the arrival of Mongol defectors and other military refugees in Mamluk territory. Known in Arabic sources as the Wafidiyya, these men were welcomed by Baybars and absorbed into his army. The remaining Crusader territories also played an important role. Baybars understood that the Franks could become useful partners for the Mongols if they were allowed to survive along the coast. Whenever the eastern frontier became relatively quiet, he therefore redirected his attention toward the Crusader fortresses of Syria and Palestine. His war against the Franks was closely connected to the wider struggle with the Ilkhanate. Between 1262 and 1277, the fighting between the Mamluks and Mongols rarely developed into a full-scale war. Nevertheless, the border was never truly peaceful. Small campaigns, sudden alarms, intelligence operations, and diplomatic maneuvers created an atmosphere of permanent insecurity. During the same period, Baybars strengthened the Mamluk army, consolidated his control over Syria, and developed closer relations with Berke Khan of the Golden Horde, one of the Ilkhanate's most dangerous rivals. For several years after Ain Jalut, neither Hulegu nor his successor Abaka sent another force into Syria comparable to the army that had crossed the frontier in 1260. Their attention was largely consumed by the war against the Golden Horde. Rather than committing major armies against Baybars, the Ilkhans relied on smaller frontier operations and encouraged their Armenian allies to attack northern Syria. One of the greatest alarms occurred in the autumn of 1262. Baybars received reports from agents inside the Mongol camp that Hulegu was assembling a large army. His spies could confirm the mobilization, but they could not determine its destination. In reality, the force was probably being prepared for the northern war against the Golden Horde. Baybars, however, had no way of knowing this. To the Mamluk Sultan, every large Mongol mobilization carried the possibility of another invasion of Syria. He immediately began preparing for the worst. Fast-moving scouts were ordered toward the Iraqi frontier. They traveled lightly, carried little equipment, and were provided with numerous replacement horses so they could move as quickly as possible. Some of them captured Mongol soldiers, but even the prisoners could not reveal where Hulegu's army intended to go. Syrian troops and Bedouin commanders were sent behind the scouts as an additional defensive force. As the reports became more alarming, Baybars prepared for a major emergency. Plans were made to evacuate civilians from vulnerable parts of Syria, and people suspected of supporting the Mongols were placed under greater scrutiny. Large numbers of refugees began moving southward toward Egypt. Baybars also ordered the destruction of the grazing lands through which a Mongol army would probably advance. Teams were sent deep into the frontier region to burn the grasslands. Some reportedly traveled as far as the areas surrounding Amid and Aklat, leaving wide stretches of pasture unusable. This was not an act of blind destruction. Mongol armies depended heavily on fresh grass for their enormous numbers of horses. They did not normally carry enough fodder to sustain their mounts over long distances. By burning the grazing areas, Baybars hoped to weaken any invasion before the Mongols could reach Syria. Travel along important roads was temporarily restricted, while further scouting parties were sent out with Bedouin guides. Every measure reflected the same fear. A second Mongol invasion might begin without warning. In the end, the expected attack never came. Hulegu's forces moved north to confront the Golden Horde rather than west towards Syria. Yet Baybar's reaction was highly revealing. It demonstrated how seriously he regarded the Mongol threat and how quickly he could mobilize the resources of the Sultanate. It also showed that the Mamluks had begun developing strategies specifically designed to counter the strengths of Mongol warfare. The same scouting operations produced an unexpected discovery. Around 200 Mongols, accompanied by their families, were approaching Mamluk territory and seeking refuge. They had previously served in Hulegu's army but belonged to a contingent connected with the Golden Horde. They became the first important group of Mongol military refugees to enter Baybars's service. Their arrival had consequences far beyond their small number. They brought valuable information about the growing conflict between Hulegu and Berke Khan. This confirmed to Baybars that the Mongol world was deeply divided and encouraged him to strengthen his relationship with the Golden Horde. Their reception also sent a message back across the frontier. Baybars did not punish Mongol defectors. Instead, he rewarded them, protected their families, and offered them positions in his army. News of this treatment encouraged others to follow. At the end of 1263, a far larger group entered the Sultanate. More than 1,300 mounted warriors arrived, probably accompanied by their households. Contemporary descriptions suggest that they were not ordinary deserters. Some were identified as Mongols, while others were described as Bahadurs, a term associated with brave or elite warriors. Their leader, Gerimun Aga, had held a position of considerable authority. Different sources describe him as a senior commander in Hulegu's army and possibly as the former Mongol governor of the Jazira. The arrival of such an experienced military figure represented a significant success for Baybars. The refugees were useful in several ways. They strengthened the Mamluk army, provided detailed knowledge of Mongol tactics, and served as proof that Hulegu's forces were neither united nor immune to desertion. Every prominent defector damaged the image of Mongol invincibility that had terrified the Islamic world for decades. Not all the Wafidiyya were ethnic Mongols. Many were Muslim soldiers from Iraq, Iran, and neighboring regions who had entered Mongol service either by choice or through necessity. After Ain Jalut, some began to believe that Mongol domination was no longer inevitable. Baybar's victories offered them an alternative. They could abandon the Ilkhanate and continue their careers under a powerful Muslim ruler. Several prominent men arrived with their followers during 1261 and 1262, including the former ruler of Erbil. Baybars received them generously and gave them positions within the Mamluk military establishment. Another important group consisted of soldiers who had served the last Abbasid caliph before the Mongol conquest of Baghdad. Led by Saif al-Din Salah, they entered Mamluk territory in the summer of 1262. Salah was first given a command in Syria and was later promoted to the rank of Amir of 40, one of the highest positions available beneath the most senior Mamluk commanders. His favorable reception encouraged him to contact former companions still living in Iraq. He informed them, along with members of the Kafaja Bedouin Confederation, that the Mamluks were prepared to accept and reward those who abandoned Mongol territory. Further groups followed. Soldiers from Shiraz arrived in 1264 accompanied by Kafaja tribesmen. The soldiers were incorporated into the Mamluk army, while the Bedouin were permitted to return home. Later that year, even the Mongol official responsible for Takrit defected to the Sultanate. Among the most remarkable refugees was Jalal al-Din Yashkar. He was the son of a senior Abbasid court official who had been executed after Hulegu captured Baghdad in 1258. Jalal al-Din survived the destruction of the caliphate and somehow gained the trust of the Mongols. Around 1263 or 1264, Hulegu instructed him to gather former Abbasid soldiers who had scattered throughout Iraq. The exact purpose of this mission is disputed. One account suggests that Hulegu wanted to recruit these men for the war against Berke Khan, especially because many were of Kipchak origin and might prove useful against the Golden Horde. A Mamluk version presents a darker explanation. According to this account, Hulegu intended to gather the former Caliphal troops in one place so they could be eliminated. Jalal al-Din supposedly discovered the plan and decided to escape with them. Whatever the truth, Jalal al-Din gathered a large and diverse following and moved westward with the assistance of the Kafaja Bedouin. When Baybars learned that this force was approaching, he reacted cautiously. The group was large, its composition was mixed, and its intentions were uncertain. The Sultan ordered an army to intercept them before they could enter the heart of the Sultanate. After receiving assurances that Jalal al-Din intended to submit peacefully, Baybars allowed him to proceed to Cairo. He arrived toward the end of 1264 with approximately 150 Mamluks, some of whom had once served his father. His followers were absorbed into the army, while Jalal al-Din received the rank of Amir of 40. For a time, his flight appeared to be another success for Baybars, but the relationship soon deteriorated. By 1266, the Sultan received reports that Mongol agents had secretly contacted Jalal al-Din. When he was arrested, horses and camels were discovered in his possession, apparently prepared for a rapid departure. Suspicion had already arisen, because he had requested permission to exchange private messages with his mother and sister, who remained inside Mongol territory. His final fate is not recorded, but it was almost certainly grim. Why Jalal al-Din would risk so much to escape from the Mongols, only to consider returning to them, remains uncertain. He may have been disappointed with his position in the Mamluk state. Perhaps he expected a higher rank or greater authority. His story revealed that political loyalty along the frontier was often fragile. Men crossed between empires not only because of religion or ideology, but also because of ambition, fear, family connections, and personal survival. While Hulegu concentrated on his war with the Golden Horde, King Hitam of Cilician Armenia attempted to exploit the situation in northern Syria. Armenia had become one of the Ilkhanat's closest regional allies, and Hitam believed Mongol support offered an opportunity to expand his own influence. Between 1262 and 1264, Armenian armies launched several attacks across the frontier. On some occasions, they were joined by Mongol troops or soldiers from Antioch. Yet none of these campaigns achieved a meaningful victory. Local Syrian forces defeated some of the incursions. Others collapsed because of severe weather. In several cases, the Armenians withdrew as soon as they learned that a larger Mamluk army was approaching. The frequency and organization of the raids suggest that they were not simple expeditions for plunder. Hitam appears to have hoped that northern Syria was too unstable to offer serious resistance. With Mongol backing, he may have believed that he could seize territory and strengthen Armenia's position before Baybars was able to respond. It was a serious miscalculation. Hitam underestimated the resilience of the Syrian defenses and the determination of the Mamluk Sultan. He also overestimated the support he could expect from the Ilkhanate. The Mongols were too deeply involved in their own wars to provide the decisive assistance Armenia required. As a result, Hitam was eventually left to face the consequences alone. The Armenian attacks did little to change the frontier, but they gave Baybars a powerful reason to strike back. He now saw Cilician Armenia not merely as a neighboring Christian kingdom, but as an active military partner of the Mongols. Its raids threatened northern Syria, supported Ilkhanid strategy, and created a possible route for future invasions. Baybars' eventual campaign against Armenia would therefore serve several purposes. It would punish Hitam for his attacks, discourage further cooperation with the Mongols, weaken Armenia's ability to support future Ilkhanid operations, and send a clear warning to every regional ruler considering an alliance against the Mamluk Sultanate. The years after Ayn Jalut were not a period of peace. They were the beginning of a prolonged struggle fought through raids, defections, intelligence networks, alliances, and carefully calculated acts of retaliation. Although the great Mongol armies had temporarily disappeared from Syria, the threat they represented continued to shape nearly every decision Baybars made. By the middle of the 1260s, the Euphrates frontier had become the most dangerous fault line between the Mamluk Sultanate and the Ilkhanate. Along this frontier stood a chain of fortresses that protected northern Syria from Mongol incursions. Among them, Albira occupied a position of exceptional importance. Located on the eastern bank of the Euphrates, Albira controlled one of the principal crossing points into Syria. Together with Al-Rahba, farther south, it formed the foundation of Baybar's defensive strategy against the Mongols. Whoever held these fortresses could observe enemy movements, launch raids across the river, and delay an invading army long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Baybars understood this clearly. In the spring of 1264, he sent one of his commanders, Saif al-Din Balaban al-Zaini, to inspect the Syrian army and examine the readiness of its fortifications. Of all the castles visited, Albira received special attention. A substantial sum of money was ordered from Damascus to support its garrison, strengthen its defenses, and ensure that its soldiers were properly supplied. Only a few months later, the fortress demonstrated its offensive value as well. A Mamluk raiding force crossed the frontier from Albira and advanced toward Qal'at al-Rum, deep inside territory influenced by the Mongols. It was one of the earliest Mamluk incursions beyond the Euphrates, and a sign that Baybars did not intend to remain permanently on the defensive. The Ilkhanids soon responded. In the winter of 1264, the Mongols turned their attention westward for the first time in several years. Their war against the Golden Horde had temporarily slowed, allowing them to gather forces near the Syrian frontier. Baybars was hunting in the Egyptian countryside when news reached him that a Mongol army was marching toward Albira. According to reports, the Mongols had been informed that the Mamluk forces were dispersed across the countryside where their horses were grazing during the winter season. If this information was accurate, the attackers may have believed they had found the perfect moment to strike. The Sultan immediately abandoned the hunt and returned to Cairo. Before arriving, he had already begun issuing orders. 4,000 lightly equipped horsemen from the Syrian army were instructed to ride toward Albira without waiting for heavy baggage or supply wagons. Speed was more important than comfort. From Cairo, Baybars dispatched another force under several senior commanders, including Izz al-Din Ughan, a formidable officer whose nickname, the Poison of Death, reflected his reputation. These soldiers also traveled in light order, carrying only what they needed for a rapid march. The following day, another 4,000 cavalrymen departed for Syria. The rulers and commanders of Hama, Aleppo, and Damascus were ordered to contribute their forces. Baybars also instructed the Bedouin chief Isa ibn Muhanna to cross the desert and raid the region around Haran. This diversion was intended to distract the Mongols and force them to defend territory behind their advancing army. Meanwhile, Baybars began gathering the main Mamluk force. Soldiers were recalled from their estates, horses were brought back from pasture, and units scattered throughout Egypt and Syria were ordered to assemble. The scale of the preparations reflected the seriousness of the threat. This was not being treated as a minor frontier raid. The survival of one of Syria's most important strongholds was at stake. Baybars left Egypt at the end of January 1265. 13 days later, he reached Gaza, where more alarming news awaited him. The Mongols had constructed 17 siege engines around Albira. This meant they intended to capture the fortress, not merely plunder the surrounding countryside. Baybars concealed the full seriousness of the situation from most of his officers, sharing the report with only two of his most trusted commanders, Sunkur al-Rumi and Qalawun. He sent urgent instructions to the relief army, encouraging it to increase its speed. Yet the Sultan himself continued advancing cautiously. He remained aware that the Franks along the coast might exploit his absence or cooperate with the Mongols. He therefore watched developments in Palestine closely and even paused to hunt during the march. His apparent lack of urgency was probably deliberate. He needed to protect the coast while ensuring that the force sent ahead reached Albira in time. The fortress, meanwhile, was fighting for its life. The Mongol army, commanded by Durbay and reportedly numbering close to a Tumen, surrounded Albira and subjected it to sustained bombardment. Stones hurled by the siege engines struck the walls and buildings, while assault parties searched for a way into the fortress. The defenders refused to surrender. Soldiers and civilians fought together, and even the women of the town reportedly took part in the defense. When the Mongols filled sections of the moat with wood in preparation for an assault, the defenders dug beneath the obstacle and set it on fire from below. The attackers also tried to scale the walls using ropes attached to projectiles or pegs fired toward the battlements. The defenders tore them away before the Mongols could climb. Day after day, the garrison held its position, waiting for the relief army. Eventually, Mamluk reinforcements appeared on the horizon. Faced with the approach of a substantial enemy force and unable to break the resistance of the fortress, the Mongols abandoned the siege. They withdrew in disorder, leaving siege engines and equipment behind. The arrival of the Mamluk army had saved Albira. King Hitam of Cilician Armenia had also been marching toward the fortress with troops intended to support the Mongols. When he heard that the siege had failed, he turned back toward his own kingdom. Some later historians suggested that news of Hulagu's death may also have contributed to the Mongol withdrawal, although the contemporary accounts provide no firm confirmation. Baybars learned of the victory while he was near Yabna in Palestine. The message had first reached Damascus by carrier pigeon and was then transmitted south through the Mamluk communication network. Even with this system, it took several days for the news to reach the Sultan. The relief of Albira was a major psychological victory, but Baybars knew the fortress remained vulnerable. He immediately ordered the army to repair the damaged walls and restore the defensive works. Supplies, weapons, and construction materials were collected from across Syria. New siege engines were installed inside the fortress, the garrison was reorganized, and provisions were stockpiled on an extraordinary scale. According to the chroniclers, Baybars wanted Albira to possess enough food and equipment to survive a siege lasting as long as 10 years. The soldiers and civilians who had defended the fortress were rewarded for their courage. During the reconstruction, another small Mongol force attempted to attack, but the Mamluks drove it back with heavy losses. The rapid relief and rebuilding of Albira sent a powerful message throughout the frontier. Baybars wanted every garrison commander, soldier, and civilian living near the Euphrates to understand that the Sultanate would not abandon them. Fortresses that resisted could expect reinforcements. Communities that remained loyal would be protected. This was as important as the military victory itself. Fear could destroy a frontier before an invading army arrived. By acting decisively, Baybars restored confidence across northern Syria. Once the repairs were complete, the Mamluks shifted from defense to retaliation. Additional troops were sent toward the frontier and ordered to raid Cilician Armenia. The details of this expedition are uncertain, but one force appears to have advanced toward the Karasu River near Antioch before withdrawing in the face of a large Armenian army. By June 1265, the principal Mamluk commanders returned to Cairo. The immediate Mongol threat had passed. Baybars now had a large army already assembled in Palestine, and he quickly turned it against another enemy, the remaining Crusader states. Within little more than 2 months, Mamluk armies captured Caesarea, Haifa, and Arsuf. They also raided the territories around Athlit and Acre. After taking the coastal cities, Baybars ordered their walls and harbors destroyed so that they could not be reoccupied or used as landing points for future European armies. This campaign established a pattern that would define the rest of his reign. When Mongol pressure increased, Baybars concentrated on the eastern frontier. When the Ilkhanid threat receded, he redirected his forces toward the Franks. The Crusader states could no longer determine the pace of the conflict. Baybars held the initiative, attacking their castles and cities whenever circumstances allowed. One by one, their territories began to disappear. When the Sultan returned to Cairo, Armenian envoys arrived at his court. They reportedly brought news of Hulagu's death and the succession of Abaka. They also described renewed conflict between the Ilkhanate and the Golden Horde. Some sources claim that Baybars briefly considered exploiting Mongol weakness by invading Iraq. Such a campaign, however, would have been extraordinarily dangerous. The Mamluk army would have needed to advance far beyond its established supply lines while leaving Syria exposed to both the Mongols and the remaining Crusader states. Throughout his reign, Baybars was willing to take bold risks, but he was rarely reckless. The suggestion of an invasion of Iraq may therefore reflect ambition or wishful thinking rather than a serious military plan. The situation along the frontier remained unstable. In the summer of 1265, Mamluk forces recovered Karkisiya, a fortress located near the junction of the Kabur and Euphrates rivers. Control of the town had changed repeatedly. A Mamluk commander had previously occupied it, but withdrew when a Mongol force approached. Later, local leaders inside. Karkisiya secretly contacted the governor of Al-Rahba and offered to submit to the Sultanate. A coordinated attack was arranged. Before dawn, Mamluk cavalry and archers advanced from Al-Rahba. Supporters inside the town opened the gates, allowing the soldiers to enter without a prolonged siege. The Mongol and Georgian troops stationed there were killed, while dozens of Muslim soldiers who had served the Mongols were captured. The victory demonstrated how uncertain political loyalties remained along the frontier. Towns could pass from one empire to another through secret negotiations, betrayal, or a sudden nighttime assault. Baybars later ordered the construction of a bridge at Al-Rahba, possibly to strengthen communication with Karkisiya and support future operations across the river. Yet the Mamluks were unable to retain the fortress permanently. By the early 1280s, it had once again returned to Mongol control. For a brief period, the frontier became quiet. During the winter of 1265 and 1266, no major Ilkhanate attack threatened Syria. Baybars used the opportunity to prepare another campaign against the Franks. In the spring of 1266, the Egyptian and Syrian armies launched devastating raids across the remaining Crusader territories. Their principal target was Safad, one of the most important Templar fortresses in the region. The siege lasted for more than a month. When Safad finally fell, its garrison was massacred. The capture removed a major Frankish stronghold from the interior of Palestine and strengthened Mamluk control over the routes connecting Damascus with the coast. With Safad secured, Baybars turned towards Cilician Armenia. King Hetum had every reason to fear what was coming. His earlier raids into northern Syria had failed, and his alliance with the Mongols had made him a direct enemy of the Mamluk Sultanate. He now attempted to prevent disaster through diplomacy. Armenian envoys arrived in Egypt carrying valuable gifts and asking for peace. Baybars rejected their request. Another mission approached him after the fall of Safad, but the Sultan reportedly refused even to accept its letter or presence. The precise details of these negotiations differ depending on the source. Mamluk chroniclers present Baybars as the ruler rejecting Armenian appeals. Christian and Armenian accounts suggest that the Sultan himself had opened negotiations, demanding Hetum's submission and the payment of tribute. Baybars may also have demanded that Cilicia allow the free export of horses, mules, grain, and iron into Mamluk territory. These were strategically important resources, and controlling their movement would weaken the Armenian kingdom while strengthening the Sultanate. Other reports claim that Baybars demanded the surrender of fortresses in northern Syria that the Armenians had seized during the Mongol invasion of 1260. Hetum refused, partly because he feared the consequences of defying the Ilkhanate, and partly because he would not accept Mamluk authority. Although the sources disagree on who initiated the talks, the result is clear. Baybars imposed conditions that Hetum could not, or would not, accept. By the summer of 1266, the Sultan had already decided to punish Armenia militarily. After arranging repairs at Safad, Baybars traveled to Damascus and ordered the army to march north. The expedition was placed under the nominal leadership of Al-Mansur, the ruler of Hama, while senior Mamluk commanders such as Qalawun, Ugan, and Aksunkur al-Farikani played central operational roles. The army left Damascus in August 1266. It advanced through northern Syria, past Al-Darbasak and Nicopolis, and approached the narrow gates of the Amanus Mountains. This was the entrance to Cilicia. The Armenian defenders understood that the mountain passes offered their best chance of stopping the invasion. They occupied fortified positions on the slopes overlooking the road. Hetum himself was absent, leaving command to his brother and two of his sons. Some accounts suggest that the Armenian king attempted a final submission when the Mamluks entered his territory. The offer was ignored, and his representatives were imprisoned. The battle began in the mountain pass. The Armenians held the higher ground, forcing the Mamluks to charge uphill against defended positions. The fighting was intense, but the attackers eventually broke through. Armenian resistance collapsed, and the surviving troops fled into the interior. The defeat was catastrophic for the royal family. Hetum's brother was killed, along with one of the king's sons. His surviving son and heir, Leon, was captured by the Mamluks. With the army destroyed and the mountain defenses breached, Cilicia lay open. There was no major force left between the Mamluk raiders and the cities, villages, monasteries, and estates of the Armenian kingdom. Hetum's alliance with the Mongols had once appeared to guarantee his security and offer opportunities for expansion into Syria. Now that same alliance had brought Baybar's army directly into the heart of his kingdom. When the Mamluk army broke through the Armenian defenses and entered Cilicia in 1266, King Hetum was nowhere near the battlefield. The sources disagree about the reason for his absence. One Mamluk account claims that Hetum had already surrendered the throne to his son Leon and withdrawn into a monastery. Armenian writers offer a very different explanation. According to them, the king was desperately seeking military assistance from the Mongols while his kingdom faced invasion. The second version appears more convincing. Bar Hebraeus reports that Hetum traveled to a Mongol commander stationed in Seljuk territory and begged him to intervene. The commander replied that he could not move without direct authorization from Abaka Khan. Permission was eventually granted, and a Mongol force was dispatched towards Cilicia. But it arrived too late. By then, the Armenian army had been defeated, the royal heir had been captured, and the Mamluks were already moving freely through the kingdom. With no organized army left to oppose them, the invaders advanced across Cilicia in several directions. Villages were burned, inhabitants were killed or taken captive, and the countryside was systematically stripped of its wealth. From the Amanus passes, the Mamluks moved toward Tol Hamdun near modern Toprakale. They then advanced to Hamus, which was set on fire, before crossing the Ceyhan River and approaching the great fortress of Al-Amudain. The castle belonged to the Teutonic Knights and guarded an important position within the Armenian kingdom. Its defenders decided to surrender, perhaps hoping to save their lives. The decision offered them no protection. The garrison was killed, while women and children were carried away as captives. A small Mongol group was also present inside the fortress. Their presence offered further evidence that Cilician Armenia had become deeply integrated into the Ilkhanid military system. The Mamluk army then turned towards Sis, the royal capital. On August 29, 1266, the invaders entered the city and began looting and destroying its buildings. They were unable to capture the citadel, but the lower city was left exposed to their soldiers. Government buildings, churches, houses, workshops, and storehouses were plundered or burned. After entering Sis, the Mamluk commanders divided their forces to extend the destruction across a wider area. Ugun marched toward the Seljuk frontier. Kalawun led another force through the Cilician plain, attacking Mamistra, Adana, Ayas, and Tarsus. The coastal fortress of Altina, controlled by the Templars, was also destroyed. Ayas was particularly important because it served as one of Cilicia's principal commercial ports. By attacking the city and its surrounding region, the Mamluks struck not only at Armenian military power, but also at the kingdom's economic lifeline. Al-Mansur of Hama remained near Sis while the other columns completed their raids. Once the operations were finished, the army reunited and began its return journey, carrying an enormous amount of plunder and thousands of captives. Baybars met the returning force near Apamea around September 20th. The expedition had achieved far more than a temporary raid. Cilicia's defenses had been shattered, members of its royal family had been killed or captured, and the kingdom's cities had suffered devastation on a scale Hetum had never anticipated. The Armenian king now faced an intensely personal crisis. One son was dead, his brother had fallen in battle, and Leon, his surviving son and designated heir, was a prisoner of Baybars. The capture of Leon opened a new phase in Mamluk-Armenian relations. The war temporarily shifted from the battlefield to a prolonged struggle of diplomacy, ransom, territorial concessions, and political pressure. Near the end of 1266, an Armenian representative arrived in Cairo to negotiate Leon's release. Baybars received this mission very differently from the Armenian embassies he had rejected before the invasion. Now the Sultan could afford to appear generous. Armenia had been punished, its army had been broken, and its heir remained under Mamluk control. Baybars granted Hetum a 1-year suspension of hostilities, but he did not release Leon. Another Armenian delegation met Baybars in Syria in October 1267. Hetum appears to have offered money and several fortresses in exchange for his son. Baybars demanded something more valuable than gold. Among the prisoners held by the Mongols was Sunkur al-Ashkar, a fellow Bahri Mamluk and one of Baybars' former comrades. Sunkur had been captured after the Mongol conquest of Aleppo and transported east when Hulegu withdrew from Syria. For Baybars, Sunkur was not simply another prisoner. He belonged to the military brotherhood from which the Sultan himself had risen. The shared background of the Bahri Mamluks created bonds of loyalty that could survive years of separation and political upheaval. Baybars informed Hetum that Leon would not be released unless the Armenian king persuaded Abaka to free Sunkur. Hetum agreed to approach the Ilkhan and requested time to negotiate at the Mongol court. Eventually, Hetum reported that Abaka had authorized an exchange. Armenian envoys arrived carrying a letter from Sunkur, apparently confirming that he was still alive and could be released. Hetum now attempted to reduce the cost of recovering his son. He seems to have hoped that surrendering Sunkur alone would satisfy Baybars, allowing Armenia to retain the fortresses it had previously offered. The Sultan refused. Baybars insisted that every part of the original bargain be fulfilled. Unless the promised strongholds were surrendered, there would be no exchange. The negotiations reached their decisive stage around the time Baybars captured Antioch in May 1268. The fall of Antioch placed the Mamluk army dangerously close to Cilicia. Hetum had already witnessed what Baybars' forces could do to his kingdom, and he had no reason to believe another invasion would be less destructive. He finally accepted the Sultan's conditions. Under the resulting agreement, 6 frontier fortresses were to pass into Mamluk hands. These included Al-Darbasak, Raban, Sheikh al-Hadid, and several other positions that controlled important routes between Cilicia, northern Syria, and the territories of the Ilkhanate. The castles were to be surrendered with the money, weapons, and supplies they had contained when the Armenians captured them during the Mongol invasion of Syria in 1260. Sunkur al-Ashkar would be exchanged for Leon, and a number of other Armenian captives would also be released. Mamluk representatives traveled north to administer the treaty. Armenian hostages were handed over as security, while Baybars waited for the fortresses to be transferred. Leon was brought from Cairo to Syria. Despite his status as the heir of an enemy kingdom, he had reportedly been treated with considerable respect during his captivity. He was even permitted to accompany Baybars on hunting expeditions. This treatment was carefully calculated. Baybars wanted Leon to understand both Mamluk strength and Mamluk generosity. The young prince was not merely a captive, he was a political instrument who might one day rule Armenia. Before his release, Leon was required to swear that he would observe the agreement. In June 1268, he was sent north toward the frontier. The exchange took place near Al-Darbasak. Leon crossed back toward Armenian territory, while Sunkur al-Ashkar returned to the Mamluk side. At the same time, Baybars' officials assumed control of the fortresses promised under the treaty. For Baybars, Sunkur's return was a personal triumph. The Sultan welcomed him warmly, promoted him to a senior command, and admitted him into his inner circle. One source claims that Sunkur persuaded Baybars not to occupy Bahasna, one of the fortresses originally included in the agreement. Hetum had apparently asked Sunkur to intervene on his behalf. The Armenian king had good reason to preserve the fortress. Bahasna stood along routes connecting Cilicia with the interior and the Ilkhanid world. If it fell permanently into Mamluk hands, Armenia's communications and commercial links with its Mongol patrons could be severely disrupted. The circumstances of Sunkur's release remain uncertain. Some accounts suggest that Abaka surrendered him without serious objection. Others claim that locating him took time and that Hetum encountered considerable difficulty before obtaining his freedom. A far more dramatic story appears in later Syrian chronicles. According to this version, Hetum secretly brought a disguised Mamluk officer to Abaka's court. Dressed as an Armenian, the officer met Sunkur and tried to convince him that Baybars genuinely intended to secure his release. Sunkur initially suspected a trap. Once persuaded, he allegedly escaped from the Mongol camp wearing Armenian clothing and traveled back with Hetum. The story is exciting, but it is probably unreliable. Hetum depended heavily on Mongol protection and could hardly afford to steal a valuable prisoner from Abaka's court. Such an action would have endangered both his throne and his kingdom. Sunkor left behind a Mongol wife and several children, suggesting that he had built a new life during his years in Ilkhanid territory. His return to the Mamluk Sultanate would later have important political consequences. Leon also emerged from the exchange with his future secured. After returning to Cilicia, he accompanied his father to Abaka's court, where he was formally recognized as Hetum's successor. Hetum then abdicated and withdrew to a monastery. This time, Armenian sources agree that his retirement was genuine. Leon became king, while his father died in 1270. Leon informed Baybars of Hetum's death, but the diplomatic relationship created by the prisoner exchange did not produce permanent peace. Mamluk raids into Cilicia resumed the following year. The successful negotiations over Leon and Sunkor briefly opened the way for direct communication between Baybars and Abaka. Yet, this was not the first contact between the two rulers. As early as 1265 or 1266, Abaka had sent representatives to Baybars while the Sultan was campaigning in Syria. The envoys carried gifts and spoke of peace. But in Mongol diplomatic language, peace rarely meant a treaty between equal rulers. It usually meant that the other side accepted Mongol supremacy. Baybars left the envoys in Damascus, and their final fate is unknown. Another diplomatic effort began in 1268 when Hetum offered to act as a mediator between the Mamluks and the Ilkhanate. Armenia's position had become extremely fragile. Antioch had fallen, Cilicia had been devastated, and Hetum knew that another Mamluk invasion could finish what the first had begun. The Armenian king therefore hoped to end the wider conflict between his Mongol patrons and Baybars. Baybars replied that Hetum could continue dealing with the matter of Sunkor's family, but he made no clear offer of broader peace. Hetum may nevertheless have represented the response to Abaka in a more optimistic way, hoping that negotiations would develop once communication had begun. The result was a serious misunderstanding, or perhaps a deliberate manipulation. Abaka believed that Baybars was considering submission. He sent official envoys through Cilicia to Damascus. Baybars ordered an officer from Aleppo to escort them and instructed that they be kept away from the local population. The precautions reflected his suspicion. Mongol ambassadors could gather intelligence, contact sympathizers, spread propaganda, or attempt to influence Mamluk officers. Baybars wanted complete control over whom they met and what they saw. The Sultan traveled from Cairo to Damascus with a small entourage early in 1269 to receive them personally. The Mongol representatives delivered a message that immediately destroyed any illusion of negotiations between equals. They declared that Abaka had inherited the power to conquer the entire world and warned that no enemy could escape him, whether by climbing into the heavens or hiding beneath the earth. They then attacked Baybars' social origins. The Sultan, they said, had once been a slave purchased in Sivas. How could such a man rebel against the rulers of the world? The insult was deliberate. Mongol political ideology placed the descendants of Genghis Khan above all other rulers. Baybars, despite commanding one of the strongest states in the Islamic world, was presented as nothing more than an escaped military slave defying his natural masters. The written message was no less aggressive. Abaka claimed that he had heard the Mamluks wish to submit and had acknowledged that Kutuz alone was responsible for executing the Mongol ambassadors before the Battle of Ain Jalut. The Ilkhan stated that previous conflicts within the Mongol world had prevented him from marching against Egypt and Syria. Those divisions, he implied, were now resolved. The authority of the Great Khan and the laws of the Mongol Empire remained supreme. If Baybars truly intended to submit, he was instructed to send senior representatives to the Mongol court. There, they would receive the commands of the Great Khan before being permitted to return. In exchange, Abaka offered to release the remaining Bahri Mamluks held in Mongol territory. The warning behind the proposal was obvious. Submission would bring rewards, refusal would bring war. Baybars rejected both the message and the assumptions behind it. In his reply, he first denied that Hatum had any authority to negotiate a peace settlement on his behalf. The Armenian king had been authorized only to discuss matters connected to Sunkur and his family. Baybars then addressed the central issue directly. How, he asked, could there be an agreement between two states whose laws, rulers, and political beliefs were completely opposed? The Mamluks possessed a religious law that Baybars regarded as greater than the traditions of Genghis Khan. God, he declared, had granted the Sultanate victory over numerous kings. Abaka's claims of universal Mongol domination were answered with a reminder of Ayn Jalut. The Mongols had already sent one of their greatest commanders into Syria, and Ketbuka had been defeated and killed. The Ilkhanate was not invincible, and Baybars had no intention of behaving as though it were. Baybars also criticized Abaka for sending ordinary representatives while demanding senior Mamluk princes in return. Had the Ilkhan sent one of his brothers, sons, or highest commanders, Baybars claimed, he might have responded with an embassy of equal rank. Another version of the Sultan's response is even more defiant. According to this account, Baybars demanded that the Mongols abandon Iraq, the Jazeera, and Anatolia. He reportedly swore that he would continue fighting until the former territories of the Abbasid Caliphate had been liberated. Whether or not these exact words were spoken, the political meaning of the exchange is unmistakable. Abaka's concept of peace still required Mamluk surrender. He continued to speak in the language of universal Mongol authority, believing that resistance was temporary and ultimately illegitimate. Baybars viewed himself as the sovereign ruler of a victorious Islamic empire. He had defeated a Mongol army, secured Egypt and Syria, strengthened the frontier, and destroyed several of the Ilkhanate's regional allies. He would not submit. The diplomatic exchange therefore ended without compromise. Baybars did not send an embassy to Abaka, and neither ruler altered his position. For the Ilkhan, peace meant recognition of Mongol supremacy. For the Sultan, peace could exist only between independent powers. As long as those definitions remained incompatible, diplomacy could do little more than carry threats from one court to another. The frontier would continue to be decided not by treaties, but by fortresses, raids, spies, prisoners, and armies. After the failed diplomatic exchange of 1269, tension along the Mamluk Ilkhanid frontier began to rise once again. Abaka Khan was no longer as heavily distracted by wars against rival Mongol rulers, and his continuing contact with European princes encouraged hopes of opening a new front against the Mamluks. At the same time, Baybars became increasingly aggressive, sending more frequent and more ambitious raids across the Euphrates. Yet the frontier had never been entirely peaceful. Even during the quieter years between 1265 and 1269, both sides continued testing one another through limited attacks, reconnaissance missions, and sudden military alarms. In the spring of 1267, Baybars was supervising the reconstruction of Safad when news arrived that Mongol troops had attacked Al-Rahba. The fortress stood on the western bank of the Euphrates and formed one of the principal pillars of the Mamluk defensive system. Any serious threat to it demanded an immediate response. Baybars hurried to Damascus and began organizing a relief expedition. Before he could march, however, another report arrived. The Mongols had already withdrawn, and the local defenders had pursued them, inflicting casualties and taking several prisoners. The reason for the Mongol retreat is unclear. The attacking force may have been too small to overcome the fortress and its garrison. Whatever its purpose, the raid ended without achieving anything, and Baybars returned to Safad. A similar alarm occurred the following year. While hunting in Egypt, the Sultan received word that a Mongol army was advancing toward Aleppo. He immediately returned to Cairo and departed for Syria in February 1268. The expected invasion never appeared. It is possible that the report had been exaggerated or deliberately circulated. Baybars may even have used the threat of a Mongol attack as a pretext to mobilize his army without revealing his true objective. That objective was the destruction of the remaining Frankish strongholds. Once the army had assembled, Baybars captured Jaffa and demolished its defenses. He then took the powerful fortress of Beaufort and raided the territory of Tripoli. From there, he marched north against Antioch. The city fell on May 19, 1268. What followed was one of the most destructive episodes of Baybar's reign. Large numbers of inhabitants were killed or enslaved, and the city that had served as one of the principal centers of the Crusader world was devastated. Its ruler, Bohemond VI, had long supported the Mongols. During the Ilkhanid invasion of Syria, he had placed his hopes in Mongol protection and had remained one of their most committed Christian allies. But when Baybars attacked Antioch, that alliance offered him no practical assistance. The Mongols were too distant, too divided, or too occupied to intervene. Bohemond learned that diplomatic loyalty to the Ilkhanate did not guarantee military rescue. The fall of Antioch caused panic throughout northern Syria. Several Frankish garrisons abandoned their castles without waiting for a direct assault. Among the most important of these was Bagras, a major Templar fortress controlling routes through the Amanus Mountains. The loss of Antioch dramatically reduced the ability of the Franks to cooperate with the Mongols. It also strengthened Baybar's position along the approaches to Cilician Armenia and the Ilkhanid frontier. The Mamluks continued their own offensive operations beyond the Euphrates. During 1268 and 1269, raiding forces from Albira and neighboring positions struck the region around Karkar in the northern Jazeera. They burned settlements, captured the fortress of Sharmushak, and killed its defenders. The identity of the garrison is uncertain. Some may have been Mongols, while others were probably local troops serving under Mongol authority. The raiders also carried away large numbers of rural inhabitants. These captives were later settled in the regions of Homs, Shazar, and Antioch. Such forced population transfers were part of the wider struggle for control of the frontier, depriving the enemy of labor while repopulating areas under Mamluk authority. At the end of 1269, Baybars decided to perform the pilgrimage to Mecca. As usual, he concealed his real intentions. Secrecy was one of the defining features of his rule. Even his own commanders were often told only what they needed to know. Movements were disguised, false objectives were announced, and military preparations were hidden behind hunting expeditions or ceremonial journeys. To mislead observers, Baybars summoned the Bedouin commander Isa ibn Muhanna and told him to prepare for an invasion of Iraq. Isa remained waiting for the expected campaign, hoping to participate in the fighting and share in the spoils. Only later did he learn that the Sultan had departed for the Hijaz. At almost the same time, a Mongol raiding party was reportedly moving toward the pilgrimage routes. According to Mamluk chroniclers, these men intended to examine the roads, plunder the surrounding country, and perhaps attack pilgrims traveling to the sanctuary. The language of the sources is highly hostile, portraying the raiders as men without respect for God, religion, or the sacred character of Mecca. Whether their true objective was an attack on the pilgrimage itself or simply reconnaissance and plunder is difficult to determine. When the raiders heard that Baybars was approaching, they abandoned the operation and withdrew. Some chroniclers claimed that Baybars had known of their plan before leaving Syria and had hoped to combine the pilgrimage with a military campaign. This is certainly possible. The Sultan maintained an effective intelligence network inside Mongol territory, and the timing of his journey may not have been accidental. Until this point, most frontier attacks had remained limited in scale. In the autumn of 1269, however, a more serious Mongol operation developed. Baybars was near Alexandria when reports reached him that the Mongols had entered northern Syria and were coordinating their movements with the Franks along the Mediterranean coast. The timing was particularly dangerous. The surviving members of an Aragonese crusading expedition had recently arrived at Acre, raising the possibility that fresh European troops might cooperate with the Ilkhanate. The Mongol force was commanded by Samagar, Abaka's leading commander in Seljuk Anatolia. His troops raided the area around the Sajur River near Aleppo and seized livestock belonging to local Bedouin communities. Baybars reacted immediately. He returned to Cairo and sent Aydegin al-Bundukdar ahead with an advance force to watch the Syrian frontier. The Sultan himself left Egypt with a relatively small contingent in November and marched toward Damascus. The journey was exceptionally difficult. Heavy rain, cold weather, and poor roads slowed the army, but Baybars reached Damascus in early December. By then, the Mongols had withdrawn. Once again, the approach of the Sultan and the concentration of Mamluk forces had been enough to end the raid. Samagar had tested the frontier but had not been prepared to fight a major battle. The following year passed without any recorded clash between the two empires. Baybars soon learned that Louis IX's crusade had been diverted to Tunis and had ended with the French king's death. Freed from the immediate danger of a large European invasion, the Sultan returned to his campaign against the Crusader states. In rapid succession, he captured some of the most important Frankish fortresses in Syria. Safita, controlled by the Templars, fell first. The great Hospitaller fortress of Crac des Chevaliers followed, along with Acre and Montfort, the principal headquarters of the Teutonic Knights. In a single campaign, Baybars struck all three major military orders. He intended to continue toward Tripoli, but new developments forced him to reconsider. Prince Edward of England arrived at Acre in the spring of 1271 with a small but disciplined force. Hugh of Lusignan, King of Cyprus, also appeared with additional troops. Baybars decided that attacking Tripoli under these circumstances would be unnecessarily dangerous. Instead, he concluded a temporary truce with Bohemond VI. To draw Hugh back towards Cyprus, the Sultan attempted a naval diversion against Limassol. The operation ended in disaster. Many of the Mamluk vessels ran aground near the Cypriot coast, and their crews were captured. The failure demonstrated the limits of Mamluk naval power. On land, Baybars possessed one of the strongest armies in the region. At sea, the Frankish and Italian fleets continued to hold major advantages. The most serious attempt at Mongol-Frankish cooperation came later that same year. Shortly after arriving in Acre, Edward sent representatives to Abaka and requested military assistance. The Ilkhan responded positively, promising to dispatch Samagar with what he described as a powerful army. In October 1271, Samagar and Mu'in al-Din Sulayman, better known as the Pervane and the dominant political figure in Seljuk Anatolia, entered northern Syria. The operation was launched on Abaka's direct orders and was intended, at least in principle, to support Edward's presence on the coast. Initial reports described Mongol raids around Aintab and an advance toward the plains near Harim. Baybars had recently completed an inspection of northern Syria and was in Damascus when the news reached him. His response suggests that he had already expected some form of coordinated offensive. He knew that the Mongols were preparing to move and that the Franks were also considering military action. Baybars immediately ordered reinforcements from Egypt. The commander Baisari was instructed to bring 3,000 troops north. The Sultan remained in Damascus until these forces arrived in early November, then marched toward the threatened region. The Mongols, meanwhile, raided Harim and Al-Ruj, killing inhabitants and plundering the countryside. Some Muslim chroniclers estimated the combined force at approximately 10,000 Mongol and Anatolian troops, although the number may have been exaggerated. Samagar and the Pervane remained near Marash with most of the army and sent around 1,500 elite cavalrymen forward to scout and raid. This advance force moved through Aintab toward Kastun and attacked Turkmen groups living between Antioch and Harim. The raids caused serious damage, but they did not yet amount to a full invasion. At Hama, Baybars joined al-Mansur and the army of Aleppo, which had withdrawn southward before the Mongol advance. The Sultan then adopted a bold strategy. He ordered much of the civilian population of northern and central Syria to evacuate, including people living near Damascus. The purpose was not simply to protect them. Baybars wanted the Mongols to believe that resistance was collapsing. If they advanced more deeply into Syria, they would move farther from their bases and become easier to surround and destroy. From Hama, Baybars dispatched several forces in different directions. A.Q. Sunkur al-Farikani led troops and Bedouin auxiliaries toward Marash in an attempt to threaten the Mongol rear. They arrived too late to confront the principal army. Another force under Taybars al-Waziri and Isa ibn Muhanna crossed the Euphrates and attacked Haran and Edessa. These raids were intended to force Samagar to worry about the security of Ilkhanid territory while operating inside Syria. Baybars himself continued marching north. Scouts moved ahead of the army, while special detachments burned the grasslands along the routes the Mongols might use. The tactic was familiar. Without access to pasture, Mongol cavalry could not remain in the field for long. As news of the approaching Mamluk army spread, Samagar withdrew. The Mongols abandoned northern Syria rather than risk a direct confrontation with Baybar's main force. The Sultan entered Aleppo on November 23, 1271. The campaign had ended before Edward's troops and the Mongols could establish meaningful contact. The most promising opportunity for a coordinated Mongol-Frankish offensive during Baybar's reign had collapsed without a major battle. The operation failed because cooperation remained largely theoretical. Edward's army was small, the Mongol force was more limited than Abarca's letter suggested, and there was no unified command structure. Messages traveled slowly, objectives were poorly defined, and neither side was willing to risk everything for the other. While Samagar withdrew, the Mamluk force commanded by Taybars and Isa reached Harran. The city had already suffered years of insecurity. Bedouin attacks and its exposed location had driven many residents to flee toward the Jazira or Syria. Only a small Mongol garrison, reportedly around 60 men, remained to defend it. When the garrison marched out to confront Isa's Bedouin troops, Taybar's soldiers suddenly appeared. Realizing they were surrounded, the Mongols surrendered. The notables of Harran came out to offer submission to the Mamluks. The Mongol governor, however, barricaded himself inside a tower and declared that he would surrender only to Baybars personally. Taybars chose not to assault the city. He withdrew to Syria, followed by several of Harran's leading inhabitants. The Mongols later decided that the town could no longer be defended. In the spring of 1272, they returned, destroyed the mosque, damaged the walls, burned parts of the market, and demolished many houses. The remaining inhabitants were forced to leave with them. Harran was abandoned. The destruction revealed the brutal logic of frontier warfare. If the Mongols could not hold the city, they preferred to deny it to the Mamluks entirely. After returning from Aleppo, Baybars planned to punish the Franks for their role in the recent crisis. He began marching toward Acre, but severe weather forced him to abandon the attack and return to Egypt. There, he received new reports of another possible Mongol advance. Yet, he did not leave Cairo immediately, suggesting that the information was uncertain or that the threat was less serious than first believed. As he moved through Palestine, negotiations began with the Kingdom of Jerusalem. On April 21, 1272, Baybars agreed to a truce lasting 10 years and 10 months. The Franks received relatively favorable conditions. Baybars had a strategic reason for showing restraint. By securing the coastal front, he could concentrate his army against the Mongols without fearing an immediate attack from Acre. The agreement did not mean that hostility had disappeared. Less than 2 months later, Baybars was involved in an attempt to assassinate Edward of England. The Mamluk Sultan distinguished between temporary political necessity and permanent friendship. A treaty could be useful without changing the identity of the enemy. Around the same time, Mongol representatives arrived in Damascus. They had been sent separately by Samagar and the Pervane. Their appearance was unusual because the initiative seems to have come from the commanders in Anatolia rather than directly from Abarca. They may have hoped to reduce tensions along their own frontier or to establish themselves as intermediaries between the two empires. The envoys delivered messages calling for peace and asked Baybars to send representatives in return. One version of Samagar's message was almost conciliatory. He complained that although he had become Baybar's neighbor, the Sultan had never contacted him. Had Baybars written earlier, Samagar claimed, he might have responded favorably. He then suggested that Baybars send a letter to Abarca promising to assist him in reaching an agreement with the Ilkhan. Baybars agreed to send 2 senior officers. They traveled through Cilicia, visited King Leon, and then continued into Anatolia, where they met Samagar and the Pervane. Both commanders received gifts from the Sultan. The Mamluk delegation then accompanied the Pervane to Abarca's court and presented additional gifts to the Ilkhan. The exact message they delivered is disputed. According to one account, Baybars warned Abarca that the Golden Horde had repeatedly encouraged him to launch a joint invasion of Ilkhanid territory. Munka Temür would attack from the north, while the Mamluks would advance from the west. Each ruler would keep whatever lands his cavalry managed to conquer. Abaka was reportedly so disturbed by this threat that he immediately left the audience. This version may have been designed to magnify Baybar's power and present the Ilkhan as intimidated by Mamluk diplomacy. Another account offers a more plausible exchange. According to this version, the envoys informed Abaka that Samagar had encouraged Baybars to open negotiations. The Sultan was prepared to stop attacking Ilkhanid territory, but only if Abaka withdrew from the Muslim lands conquered by the Mongols. The Ilkhan refused. He proposed instead that each ruler retain whatever territory he already possessed. The meeting then deteriorated, with Abaka speaking harshly to the envoys. No agreement was reached, although the Mamluk representatives were allowed to return safely. They arrived back in Damascus in September 1272. Whatever words were actually spoken, Baybar's position remained unchanged. He was not prepared to recognize Mongol rule over Iraq, the Jazeera, or Anatolia. Abaka, for his part, had no intention of surrendering territories won by his dynasty. The exchange therefore had little chance of producing peace. Baybar's message was deliberately provocative. He may have wanted to demonstrate that the Mamluk Sultanate was not negotiating from weakness. The Ilkhanate had been defeated at Ain Jalut, the Golden Horde remained its enemy, and the Mamluks were now capable of launching raids beyond the Euphrates. Abaka still viewed himself as the representative of a universal Mongol imperial order. Even when speaking of peace, he expected the opposing ruler to acknowledge Mongol superiority. Baybars rejected that worldview entirely. He publicly presented himself as the protector of Islam, the defender of Syria and Egypt, and the ruler who would one day recover the former lands of the Abbasid Caliphate. The two political visions could not be reconciled. In the summer of 1272, new rumors of a Mongol attack reached Damascus. Baybar's envoys had not yet returned, and the Sultan could not know whether their mission had failed or whether Abaka was preparing a military response. After consulting his commanders, Baybars secretly returned to Egypt to mobilize the main army. His movements were concealed, and he reached Cairo through the rapid postal system. Within 2 weeks, the Egyptian army began marching towards Syria. Baybars followed shortly afterward and returned to Damascus before the end of August. The expected offensive did not materialize. Instead, news arrived that another Mongol delegation was approaching. Baybars ordered the envoys to perform the Mongol gesture of submission before the governors of Aleppo and Hama. This was a calculated humiliation. The Ilkhans demanded that foreign rulers show obedience to Mongol representatives. Baybars reversed the ritual, forcing Abaka's envoys to display submission before Mamluk officers. When the delegation reached Damascus, its first message appeared peaceful. The envoys asked what benefit could come from continued hostility and what harm could come from peace. Abaka suggested that Sunkur al-Ashkar, who had once lived among the Mongols, should serve as mediator. At a later meeting, however, the true meaning of the proposal became clear. The envoys declared that Baybars, or at least the highest-ranking ruler beneath him, should personally travel to Abaka's court to secure peace. To the Mongols, such a visit would have represented submission. Baybars answered in kind. If Abaka truly desired peace, then the Ilkhan himself or one of his brothers should come to the Mamluk court. The negotiations ended immediately. The envoys were dismissed and sent back the following month. These exchanges were not serious attempts to resolve the conflict. They were another battlefield in the wider struggle between the two empires. Both rulers used diplomacy to intimidate the enemy, test his confidence, and impress their own military elites. Every message was intended not only for the foreign court, but also for commanders and officials at home. Abaka needed to show that the Ilkhanate still claimed supremacy despite its defeats. Baybars needed to demonstrate that the Mamluks would never submit to the descendants of Genghis Khan. The letters, envoys, insults, and ceremonial gestures formed part of a psychological war running parallel to the fighting along the Euphrates. Neither ruler expected peace on equal terms. Neither was prepared to accept the political order imagined by the other. For Abaka, peace required recognition of Mongol authority. For Baybars, peace required the Mongols to abandon conquered Muslim lands and accept the Mamluk Sultanate as an independent power. Until one side suffered a decisive defeat, diplomacy could achieve little. The frontier remained tense, and every pause in the fighting was merely an interval before the next raid, alarm, or invasion. Soon after the Mongol representatives left Mamluk territory, the frontier erupted once again. This time, the target was Al-Bira, the fortress that guarded one of the most important crossings of the Euphrates. The attack began in late November 1272. Baybars was in Damascus when reports arrived that a Mongol army was advancing toward the fortress. He reacted at once. Egyptian forces that had already been summoned to Syria were placed under marching orders, while separate detachments were sent toward Harim and the northern frontier. Baybars moved through Hama, where he gathered boats for a possible crossing of the Euphrates. As the army approached Aleppo, Mamluk cavalry and Bedouin scouts rode ahead to discover the size and position of the enemy. They returned near Manbij with alarming news. Around 3,000 Mongol troops had taken up positions on the eastern side of the river. Baybars continued forward and reached the Euphrates on December 11th. The Mongol expedition was commanded by Durbai, the same officer who had led the earlier siege of Al-Bira in 1265. He personally directed the attack against the fortress, supported by troops from Seljuk Anatolia and supplied with siege engines, including mangonels. While Durbai concentrated on the walls, another Mongol commander named Chinkar guarded the river crossing with several thousand men. The Mongols expected a relief army and had carefully prepared the ground before Baybars arrived. They selected a particularly dangerous ford and attempted to make it appear easier than it really was. Their plan was simple: lure the Mamluks into crossing at the worst possible point, attack them while they struggled through the deep water, and destroy them before they could form ranks on the eastern bank. Behind the crossing, the Mongols erected a defensive barrier and prepared to fight on foot with bows. From this position, they could strike at soldiers emerging from the river while remaining protected behind their fortifications. The trap initially worked. Baybars first sent infantry archers across in boats to inspect the opposite bank. Then the main army began entering the river. The water was so deep that many soldiers had to swim while holding the reins of their horses. The first wave included some of the most experienced Mamluk commanders. Qalawun, who would later become Sultan, was among those who entered the river before the main force. Baybars followed behind the vanguard. As the Mamluks struggled up the eastern bank, the Mongols attacked. The fighting quickly became violent and confused. Archery gave way to close combat as the Mamluks tried to establish a foothold beyond the river. The Mongols possessed the better position, but they were unable to throw the attackers back into the water. Gradually, the Mamluks broke through. Chinkar was killed during the battle, reportedly by Ketbugar al-Mansuri, another future sultan. Around 200 Mongol soldiers were captured, while the survivors fled from the river. The defeat immediately affected the siege of Al-Bira. When Durbai learned that the force protecting the crossing had been destroyed, he abandoned the operation. The Mongols were apparently close to capturing the fortress, but remaining there now carried the risk of being trapped between the garrison and Baybars' army. They withdrew in haste, leaving behind mangonels and other siege equipment. Mamluk cavalry pursued them towards Saruj, while Baybars briefly returned to the western side of the river. The exact reason for this movement is unclear. Several days later, he crossed again and entered Al-Bira. The defenders had survived another determined Mongol siege. Baybars rewarded the governor, soldiers, and inhabitants of the fortress for their resistance. Once the immediate danger had passed, the Sultan returned to Damascus, arriving there near the end of December. The victory was strategically important. Had Durbai captured Al-Bira, the Ilkhanate would have gained a permanent base on the Syrian side of the frontier. Mongol armies could then have crossed the Euphrates more easily, stored supplies near the river, and launched future campaigns deeper into Mamluk territory. Instead, the fortress remained in Baybars' hands, and another Ilkhanid attempt to secure a bridgehead in Syria had failed. A Persian account presents the campaign in a much more dramatic form. According to this version, the defenders sent emergency messages by carrier pigeon, and Baybars promised to reach them within 7 days. The Sultan then supposedly rode ahead of his army with only 7 Mamluks and arrived near Al-Bira in 4 days. he raised his banners on a hill opposite the fortress, giving hope to the defenders. When the main Mamluk army arrived days later and entered the river without hesitation, the Mongols allegedly lost heart and fled despite possessing a much larger force. This story turns Baybars into a heroic rescuer, arriving almost alone before his army. Yet it omits the crucial battle at the ford and contradicts several details preserved by the Mamluk eyewitnesses. The more reliable evidence suggests that the victory resulted not from a theatrical appearance by the Sultan, but from careful preparation, rapid mobilization, and a difficult river assault led by experienced commanders. The failed expedition deeply angered Abaka. When Dubai returned, the Ilkhan condemned him for fleeing without injury while Chinkar had died fighting. Dubai was removed from command and sent into exile, while another commander was appointed in his place. The message was clear. Failure against the Mamluks carried serious consequences at the Ilkhanid court. The frontier war continued the following year. In the summer of 1273, Baybars ordered the governor of Aleppo, Hussam al-Din Lachin al-Aintabi, to attack the Armenian fortress of Kainuk. The stronghold stood northeast of Marash near the Aksu River and had become a center of attacks against travelers moving between Syria and Ilkhanid territory. According to Mamluk reports, Armenian raiders disguised themselves by wearing Mongol-style headgear before attacking merchants and messengers. The disguise allowed them to conceal their identity and perhaps place responsibility for their actions on the Mongols. Baybars first demanded that the Armenian king stop the attacks. When nothing changed, he authorized military action. Lachin reached Kainuk in July 1273. Both the town and the citadel were captured. The male population was killed, while women and children were taken prisoner. The Mamluks then continued toward another settlement, probably not the famous city of Tarsus, but a smaller place located nearer the Euphrates. The geography of the campaign makes this interpretation more likely. Kainuk was not permanently occupied. The expedition was intended as punishment, not conquest. It destroyed the local base used by raiders and demonstrated that Armenian territory was no longer beyond Mamluk reach. A Christian chronicler may have recorded the same campaign under a different name. He described Syrian raiders advancing from Albira and Aintab, attacking a town near the Euphrates, taking many captives, and returning quickly before Mongol forces could intercept them. The details are not identical, but they reflect the same pattern. Rapid Mamluk raids designed to inflict damage and disappear before the Ilkhanid army could respond. Later that summer, Baybars received new warnings of a possible Mongol invasion. He left Cairo with several senior commanders in August 1273. While traveling, additional reports arrived, apparently confirming that a major attack was approaching. The Sultan ordered a broad mobilization. The Egyptian army was commanded to march north. Some accounts even claim that Bedouin tribes from Egypt were summoned and that every man in the Sultanate who owned a horse was expected to appear. Syrian villages were supposedly required to provide mounted men according to their resources. These descriptions may exaggerate the scale of the order, but they reveal how serious the threat appeared. Baybars was preparing for a general campaign, not a minor frontier raid. In the end, the expected invasion never developed. The Egyptian army reached Palestine, where Baybars met it after traveling north toward Damascus and then turning back. No large Mongol army appeared, and the mobilization gradually lost its urgency. Rumors of Ilkhanid activity continued, however. To gather information and distract the enemy, Baybars ordered Isa ibn Muhanna to lead his Bedouin tribes across the Euphrates. They advanced as far as Al-Anbar and encountered a group of Mongols. The Mongols withdrew without fighting. According to Mamluk writers, they mistakenly believed that Baybars himself commanded the raiders. Isa then fought a long engagement against the Kafaja Bedouin of Iraq. The battle continued for much of the day, but produced no decisive result. A possible explanation for the disappearance of the expected Mongol offensive appears in a memorandum later presented to the Council of Lyon. It claimed that Abaka had been preparing a campaign against Egypt in 1273, but postponed it when he learned that European church leaders were gathering to discuss a new crusade. The Ilkhan may have hoped that his plans would become part of a wider Christian Mongol strategy. If so, diplomacy once again delayed military action. The same period brought another important military refugee into Baybars's service. Shams al-Din Bahadur, ruler of Sumaysat, had inherited connections to the old Khwarezmian military world. The Mongols suspected that he was secretly communicating with Baybars and placed him under arrest. Their suspicions were correct. Bahadur escaped from the Mongol camp and made his way toward the Sultanate. More than 1,000 of his soldiers and Mamluks had reportedly fled before him and had already been welcomed by Baybars. When Bahadur finally arrived, he received estates in Egypt and a command in the Mamluk army. He was first appointed an emir of 20 and was later promoted to the rank of emir of 40. His arrival followed the pattern established by earlier Wafidiyya. Baybars used defectors not only to increase his military strength, but also to weaken Mongol authority and gather intelligence about the Ilkhanate. By 1274 and 1275, the Sultan once again turned his attention towards Cilician Armenia. For several years, the Armenian kingdom had escaped a major Mamluk invasion. This relative calm probably resulted less from any lasting treaty than from Baybar's preoccupation with the Mongol frontier and the Crusader states. During the interval, Cilicia recovered. The port of Ayas was rebuilt and developed into a prosperous center of international commerce. The destruction of Antioch helped accelerate this growth. Trade moving from Ilkhanid territory toward the Mediterranean increasingly passed through Ayas rather than through cities under Mamluk control. Genoese merchants received new commercial privileges, strengthening the port's connection to the Black Sea, the Eastern Mediterranean, and Europe. Its success also made it an attractive target. By attacking Ayas and the routes leading to it, Baybars could damage Armenian wealth, interrupt Ilkhanid commerce, and weaken an ally of the Mongols without directly invading the heart of the Ilkhanate. Armenian accounts suggest that Baybars had considered another invasion as early as 1271. According to this version, King Leon sent envoys and persuaded the Sultan to withdraw. Leon then traveled to Abaka and received a promise that 20,000 Mongol troops would be sent to protect Cilicia. A smaller Mongol contingent reportedly returned with him. Mamluk sources do not mention this campaign, making the story difficult to verify. What is certain is that no large Mongol army was present when Baybars invaded Cilicia several years later. The reasons for the new campaign differed depending on the chronicler. One account claims that Leon had stopped paying an agreed tribute, rebuilt fortresses, violated earlier conditions, and failed to provide reliable intelligence to the Mamluks. The Armenian attacks around Kainuk were also cited as evidence of continued hostility. Another source suggests that the campaign was connected to secret communications from the Pervon, the most powerful figure in Seljuk Anatolia. Fearing Mongol domination, the Pervane allegedly encouraged Baybars to attack Cilicia and promised that the Sultan could later extend his authority into Anatolia. The two explanations are not necessarily contradictory. Baybars may have had several objectives at once. He wanted to punish Armenia, weaken a Mongol ally, disrupt trade between the Ilkhanate and Europe, and prepare the routes that might one day carry a Mamluk army into Seljuk territory. Before launching the main invasion, the governor of Aleppo led an initial raid toward Marash. His troops plundered the countryside and damaged the outer defenses of the town. An Armenian account claims that the raiders were defeated. Mamluk writers say nothing about such a reverse, making it impossible to know whether a limited clash occurred or whether the Armenian source exaggerated a minor success. The principal campaign began in February 1275. After reviewing his army, Baybars left Cairo and marched toward Damascus. Syrian troops joined him there, along with Al-Mansur of Hama and Bedouin auxiliaries. From Damascus, the army moved north. Near Aleppo, Baybars left behind the heavy baggage and part of the force. The main striking army continued toward Al-Darbasak and the roads leading into Cilicia. A forward detachment was sent to seize the crossing over the Karasu. The ford proved difficult, but the Mamluks forced their way across and established a camp between Al-Darbasak and Bagras. Baybars took elaborate measures to conceal his true position. He ordered Lakhn al-Aintabi and Isa ibn Muhanna to march toward Al-Bira with a separate force. Their task was to create the impression that they formed the advance guard of the entire Mamluk army. The deception was aimed at both the Mongols and Armenians. If enemy scouts believed Baybars was moving toward the Euphrates, they would be less prepared for an attack through the Amanus region. After reaching Al-Bira, the diversionary force crossed into the Jazeera and raided Ras al-Ain. The Mongol troops stationed there withdrew rather than fight, allowing the Mamluks to loot the settlement before returning to Syria. While attention was drawn eastward, Baybars and the main army stood poised near the entrances to Cilicia. The Sultan had once again combined mobility, secrecy, diversion, and frontier warfare. The next stage of the campaign would not be a limited raid. It would be a direct assault on the wealth, cities, and strategic position of the Armenian kingdom. Before entering the narrow passage known as the Syrian Gate, just south of Alexandretta, Baybars ordered several senior commanders into the surrounding mountains. Their task was probably to scout the slopes, clear possible ambush positions, and drive out any Armenian troops hiding above the road. The Mamluk army crossed the pass on March 20th, 1275, and then moved north along the coast before turning inland toward Mamistra. Kalawun and Bilig al-Khaznadar led the advance guard and reached the city before the population had time to prepare. At dawn, the vanguard entered Mamistra by surprise. The attack was sudden and destructive, and many of the inhabitants were killed before organized resistance could begin. Around the same time, groups of local Turkmen and Bedouin appeared before Baybars. They brought horses and livestock and declared their loyalty to the Sultan. Rather than allowing them to remain with the army, Baybars sent them south into Syria, perhaps to protect them from the devastation spreading across Cilicia or to remove an unpredictable element from the battlefield. The main Mamluk army then advanced towards Sis, the Armenian capital. Baybars entered the city on March 28th. From there, he rode farther north toward the Cilician gates, where he encountered Mongol women and children. Their presence probably marked the remains of a Mongol camp that had been abandoned in great haste. The discovery was significant. It showed that Mongol personnel had been operating inside Armenia, but also that they had withdrawn before Baybars arrived. Once again, the Armenian kingdom found itself exposed while the military support promised by its Ilkhanid allies failed to appear in time. Baybars returned to Sis and celebrated the end of Ramadan inside the captured capital. The citadel remained beyond his reach, but the city below was thoroughly devastated. Buildings were looted, neighborhoods were burned, and much of the economic and administrative center of the kingdom was destroyed. Meanwhile, Mamluk columns spread across the Cilician plain. Some advanced toward Tarsus and Adana. Others reached the coast, while additional detachments moved against lesser-known fortresses and settlements throughout the kingdom. One group may have reached as far west as Karikas. The force commanded by Baisari and Itamish al-Sadi struck Ayas, one of the most important ports in the eastern Mediterranean. The city had prospered after the destruction of Antioch, becoming a major commercial gateway between the Ilkhanid world and Europe. The Mamluk attack was devastating. Soldiers entered the city, killing inhabitants and setting buildings on fire. Some Armenians and Frankish merchants attempted to escape by sea. A number reached boats, while others drowned during the flight. The attack on Ayas was more than a raid for plunder. It struck at one of the Armenian kingdom's most valuable economic centers and disrupted the commercial routes that connected Mongol territory with Mediterranean markets. After spreading destruction across the country, the various Mamluk columns rejoined Baybars at Mamistra. They returned carrying enormous quantities of booty, livestock, captives, and more Mongol women and children found during the campaign. The army then began its march back towards Syria. On the way, it attacked Tol Hamdun before crossing the Amanus Mountains once again. By April 18th, the Mamluks had returned through the Syrian Gate. They camped near Harim, where the captured wealth was gathered and redistributed among the army. Baybars finally returned to Damascus on June 1st, 1275. The campaign had lasted only a few months, but its effects were severe. Cilician Armenia had been invaded almost without resistance. Its capital had been ruined, its principal port attacked, and its countryside stripped of people and resources. King Leon had been almost completely absent from the campaign. According to information supplied by Mamluk spies inside the Armenian royal entourage, Leon had withdrawn with his army into the mountains near the territory of the Karaman Turkmen. This may explain why the Mamluks encountered so little coordinated resistance. Leon's caution was understandable. Less than a decade earlier, he had been captured during the disastrous Armenian defeat of 1266. He had seen members of his family killed, his kingdom devastated, and himself carried away as a prisoner. He may have believed that preserving the Armenian army was more important than risking another direct confrontation with Baybars. Only one organized force appears to have challenged the invasion. It reportedly consisted of around 1,500 Armenians and 500 Franks. Some accounts claim that Baybars personally fought against them, while others state that Syrian units defeated them. Whatever the exact circumstances, the resistance was quickly overcome and did not slow the larger Mamluk campaign. A Christian source later claimed that Leon emerged after the Mamluk withdrawal and attacked the Turkmen who had also been plundering Armenian territory. The story is possible, but it cannot be confirmed with certainty. The devastation of Cilicia did not end the struggle along the Euphrates. In the following year, Abaka sent another major army against Albira. The command was entrusted to Abtai, who had replaced Derbai after the failure of the previous siege. This new expedition was far larger than most earlier frontier operations. It included Mongol troops, forces from Seljuk Anatolia under the Pervane, and contingents drawn from Mardin, Mayafarikin, Mosul, Shahrazur, and Iraq. Contemporary estimates placed the total army at around 30,000 men, roughly half of them Mongols. The composition of the fort demonstrated the resources available to the Ilkhanate. Abaka was not relying on Mongol cavalry alone. He had gathered soldiers from across the western regions of his empire and from allied or subordinate territories. Baybars was in Damascus when reports of the advance arrived. He ordered the army to mobilize but did not immediately march. He had learned from experience that frontier intelligence could be incomplete or misleading, and he waited for confirmation. The reports soon became definite. On November 29, 1275, the Mongol army reached Albira and began erecting siege engines. Baybars left Damascus on December 8th. Remarkably, the Mongols withdrew on the same day. News of their retreat reached Baybars shortly after his departure, but he did not trust the first report. He continued north toward Homs until further messages confirmed that the siege had truly ended. Only then did he return to Damascus. The Mongol withdrawal appears to have been caused by several problems at once. Winter conditions were severe. Snow covered the region, temperatures fell sharply, and many horses died. This was a critical weakness for an army whose mobility and combat power depended upon large numbers of mounted troops. Supplies were also running low. Albira had been strengthened after earlier attacks and was now well prepared for another siege. Its garrison had sufficient provisions, strong defenses, and experience resisting Mongol siege tactics. The defenders damaged some of the Ilkhanid siege engines and even launched a successful attack during the night. The siege was already proving difficult when another danger emerged inside the Mongol army. The commanders learned that the Pervane had been secretly communicating with Baybars. He was suspected of planning to betray the Ilkhanid army once the Mamluks arrived. This created a serious crisis of trust. Much of the invading force consisted of Muslim troops from Anatolia, Iraq, and neighboring regions. The Mongol commanders feared that these men might follow the Pervane, defect to Baybars, or turn against them during battle. They reportedly considered killing the unreliable contingents, but hesitated. An attempted massacre could have caused thousands of soldiers to flee directly into Albira and join the Mamluks. With supplies disappearing, horses dying, siege equipment failing, and internal loyalty uncertain, remaining before the fortress became increasingly dangerous. The commanders chose to retreat before Baybars arrived. They could later justify their decision to Abaka by pointing to the winter weather, disease, lack of provisions, and damaged equipment. All of these explanations were valid, but the possibility of betrayal may have been equally important. The failure of the siege demonstrated once again that capturing Albira required more than a large army. The fortress had become the anchor of the Mamluk frontier, supported by strong defenses, reliable communications, and the knowledge that Baybars would mobilize immediately if it came under attack. The repeated struggles over Albira also reveal a striking difference between Mamluk and Ilkhanid historical writing. Mamluk chroniclers recorded the frontier conflict in extraordinary detail. Almost every year produced reports of raids, spies, envoys, alarms, troop movements, sieges, or defections. They also preserved information about events taking place inside the Ilkhanate itself. Persian historians writing under Mongol rule were far less interested in these incidents. Their major chronicles contain surprisingly little about the constant fighting along the Syrian frontier or the diplomatic exchanges with Baybars. The difference cannot be explained only by the number of surviving sources. Although Mamluk historical writing was more extensive, the great Persian chronicles were also large and highly detailed. They simply devoted much less attention to the Syrian border. The most convincing explanation lies in the different importance each empire attached to the conflict. For the Mamluks, the Mongol threat was existential. A single major defeat could have reopened Syria to invasion, endangered Damascus, and eventually exposed Egypt itself. The memory of Baghdad's destruction remained fresh, and no Mamluk ruler could assume that Mongol expansion had permanently ended. Even minor raids therefore mattered. Every fortress lost, every river crossing seized, and every Mongol army seen near the Euphrates could become the beginning of a much larger catastrophe. This anxiety naturally shaped Mamluk historical writing. Chroniclers recorded the frontier war because their society regarded it as a struggle for survival. The Mamluks also had victories to celebrate. Their garrisons repeatedly resisted Mongol attacks, their armies crossed the Euphrates, and Baybars responded successfully to most frontier crises. These achievements strengthened the legitimacy of the Sultan and deserved prominent treatment in official histories. For the Ilkhanate, the Syrian frontier was important but not always decisive. Abaka and his commanders were fighting on several fronts across an enormous territory. Wars against the Golden Horde and the Chagatai Mongols could threaten the survival of the Ilkhanid state far more directly than a failed raid into Syria. A setback at Al-Bira was embarrassing, but it did not place Tabriz or the center of the Ilkhanate in immediate danger. The limited importance of the Syrian front, combined with the repeated failure of Mongol operations there, probably explains the silence of many Persian chroniclers. There was little reason to emphasize campaigns that ended in withdrawal, damaged the prestige of Ilkhanid commanders, and produced no lasting territorial gains. Only in 1277, when Baybars crossed the frontier and invaded Seljuk Anatolia, did Persian writers begin to give the Mamluk enemy their full attention. Until then, the struggle remained unevenly remembered. For the Mamluks, it was the central military challenge of the age. For the Ilkhanids, it was one difficult frontier among several. That difference in perspective shaped not only how the war was fought, but also how it was recorded and remembered. Baybars understood that the Mongol threat could not be defeated through armies and fortresses alone. The Ilkhanate stretched across an enormous territory, and Mongol forces could appear on the Syrian frontier with little warning. To survive, the Mamluk Sultanate needed information before the enemy moved. For this reason, Baybars created a permanent intelligence network that reached deep into Mongol-controlled lands. Its purpose was not merely to discover where enemy armies were located. The system gathered information about military preparations, political divisions, regional governors, discontented officers, possible defectors, and the relations between the Ilkhans and their Christian allies. Information obtained by these agents allowed Baybars to react quickly. When Mongol armies mobilized, he could reinforce the frontier, evacuate civilians, burn grazing lands, summon troops from Egypt, or send raiders into the enemy's rear. But Baybars did not limit himself to passive observation. He used assassination, deception, forged correspondence, political pressure, and secret negotiations to weaken the Ilkhanate from within. He contacted Muslim rulers and commanders living under Mongol authority, encouraged them to rebel, and offered protection to those willing to escape with their troops. The raids beyond the Euphrates, the destruction of pasture land, and the attempts to restore Muslim rulers in Iraq could all be considered part of the same hidden conflict. The open war was fought by armies. The secret war was fought through fear, suspicion, betrayal, and information. Baybars' successors continued these methods long after his death. Espionage remained an important feature of the conflict until the Mamluk-Ilkhanid War formally ended in the early 14th century. The Mamluks also used similar methods against the Crusader states. Frankish castles, ports, and courts were observed just as carefully as Mongol territory. Baybars needed to know whether the Franks were preparing an attack, receiving European reinforcements, or negotiating with the Ilkhans. The Mongols attempted their own espionage operations, but the surviving evidence presents them as far less successful. This picture must be treated cautiously. Most surviving accounts were written on the Mamluk side. Mamluk chroniclers naturally knew about Mongol agents only when they were captured or their missions failed. Successful Ilkhanid espionage would have left far fewer traces. Persian and Armenian sources reveal almost nothing about these operations. As a result, the balance of success may appear more favorable to Baybars than it truly was. Even so, the organization of the Mamluk intelligence service is unusually clear. Earlier, Ayyubid rulers had used spies against their Frankish neighbors, but it is uncertain whether they maintained a permanent, centralized system. Baybars operated on a different scale. He controlled Egypt and most of Syria through a highly centralized government and faced threats from the Mongols, Armenians, and Franks simultaneously. He had both the motivation and the resources to establish a professional intelligence service. Qutuz had already taken an early step in this direction after the victory at Ain Jalut. He appointed a governor of Aleppo who had family connections in the Jazira and could use them to obtain information about Mongol movements. Baybars transformed such personal connections into a regular institution. His biographer and private secretary, Ibn Abd al-Zahir, repeatedly praised the Sultan's determination to obtain intelligence. According to him, this network provided early warnings of Mongol and Armenian attacks and helped expose enemy agents inside the Sultanate. Such praise might appear exaggerated, since Ibn Abd al-Zahir wrote to glorify Baybars. Yet he was also the Sultan's confidential secretary and had direct access to sensitive government affairs. His account is supported by other contemporary writers. At the heart of the intelligence network were men called Qusad. The word could simply mean messengers or envoys. In the context of Baybars' secret operations, however, it often referred to trained couriers and intelligence agents who traveled regularly between the Sultanate and enemy territory. These men crossed borders, carried hidden messages, contacted local informants, and transported intelligence back to the Mamluk court. Baybars' agents traveled from cities such as Baghdad, Aklat, and other regions controlled by the Ilkhanate. Their work was extremely dangerous. Capture could mean torture or execution. For that reason, Baybars paid them generously. Anyone ordered to risk his life in enemy territory had to be compensated accordingly. The agents did not work alone. Once inside Mongol-controlled lands, they identified local people willing to provide information. These informants could report on troop movements, political disputes, military preparations, and the intentions of regional commanders. The intelligence service was supervised by Saif al-Din Balaban al-Rumi, one of Baybars' most trusted personal Mamluks. Balaban alone met the secret agents, managed their salaries, and controlled access to their identities. Their names were deliberately excluded from the official military registers, and even senior members of the Mamluk establishment were kept unaware of their activities. Agents arriving during daylight could be veiled so that no one would recognize them. This secrecy extended to the highest levels of government. Neither the vizier nor the vice-sultan appears to have been fully involved in Balaban's work. Only a very small number of trusted officers participated in the administration of spies, couriers, and secret correspondence. The arrangement reduced the possibility of leaks. It also ensured that intelligence reached Baybars through men whose loyalty was personal rather than merely institutional. Balaban held the office of Dawadar, traditionally translated as the keeper of the inkwell. By Baybars' reign, this position had become increasingly important in the management of the chancery and official communications. Because another officer involved in intelligence operations also held the same title, supervision of the Secret Service may have gradually become one of the Dawadar's responsibilities. Not every mission was directed from Cairo or Damascus. Frontier commanders could also send agents into Mongol territory. The governor of Al-Rahba, for example, maintained his own contacts beyond the Euphrates. The distinction between a courier and a spy was often unclear. The same word might describe an ordinary diplomatic messenger, a confidential envoy, or an operative gathering military information. In the medieval world, these roles naturally overlapped. A man carrying a letter could also observe roads, count troops, identify fortifications, and speak with potential informants. The Mamluk sources occasionally used another word, jawasis, meaning spies. Yet Qusad appears to have been the more common technical term for men involved in intelligence work. The identities of most agents remain unknown. This silence was probably deliberate and reflects the secrecy surrounding their work. Those whose names do survive were generally not Mamluks of Turkish origin. Arabic and Persian-speaking agents could move through Iraq, Iran, Armenia, and Syria without attracting as much attention as a Turkish military slave speaking an unfamiliar local dialect. Some may have disguised themselves as merchants, pilgrims, scholars, or religious mendicants. Traveling agents faced danger not only from the Mongols. Armenian officials, hostile Bedouin tribes, local rulers, and bandits could also intercept them. Every journey required knowledge of roads, languages, political loyalties, and safe places to hide. The couriers formed only one half of the intelligence system. Inside enemy territory, Baybars relied on a wide network of local correspondents and informants. Mamluk writers describe them using terms meaning trusted advisors, sincere friends, correspondents, possessors of information, or simply eyes. These descriptions reveal how the Mamluks viewed them. They were not portrayed as dishonorable traitors, but as loyal Muslims providing truthful information against a dangerous enemy. Many of these informants probably acted voluntarily. Religious solidarity may have encouraged Muslim officials and inhabitants of Mongol-ruled lands to assist Baybars. Others were undoubtedly motivated by political ambition, resentment, personal survival, or the hope of future rewards. The agents identified useful local contacts, collected their reports, and carried the information back to the Sultanate. This system produced concrete results. In 1262, Baybars received advance warning that Hulegu was assembling a large army. Although the force eventually marched against the Golden Horde rather than Syria, the intelligence allowed the Sultan to prepare for an invasion before it was too late. The network also warned him of Armenian attacks and helped uncover Mongol spies and their local supporters. It probably provided information about negotiations between the Ilkhans and the Frankish powers as well. Baybars often seemed to know when Mongol and Christian forces were discussing coordinated operations. Not all intelligence came from professional agents. Mongol defectors, merchants, pilgrims, frontier scouts, Bedouin tribes, and travelers also brought valuable information. Refugees from Ilkhanid territory could describe conditions inside Mongol armies, while merchants knew which roads were open and where troops were gathering. Yet such information arrived irregularly. A permanent intelligence service was far more reliable because it gathered reports continuously rather than waiting for useful news to appear by chance. The Qusad also maintained secret contact with regional rulers and military commanders inside the Ilkhanate. These communications served several purposes. They produced intelligence, encouraged rebellion, and persuaded prominent men to defect with their soldiers. Baybars contacted rulers in Shiraz, Hisan Kaifa, Sumaysat, Georgia, and Seljuk Anatolia. One of the most important of these figures was the Pervan, whose secret relations with Baybars would later contribute to the Mamluk invasion of Anatolia. The Iraqi Bedouin were another vital source of information. The Kafaja tribe, whose members moved through the regions around Hit, Anbar, Hilla, and Kufa, knew the roads and political conditions of Iraq better than most professional soldiers. Their mobility allowed them to observe Mongol movements, escort secret envoys, and help defectors reach Syria. In the early 1260s, Baybars received several Kafaja and Abada chiefs and instructed them to watch the Mongols. Their cooperation may have been inspired partly by religious opposition to non-Muslim rulers, but Bedouin resistance to centralized authority was probably equally important. Their loyalty was never guaranteed. Some Kafaja groups assisted the Mamluks, while others attacked caravans and raided Syrian territory. Like many frontier tribes, they supported whichever side offered the greatest advantage at a particular moment. Baybars, nevertheless, cultivated them carefully. He welcomed their chiefs, gave them robes of honor, offered military ranks, and sent them back to Iraq with messages for other tribal leaders. He also used them to communicate with the ruler of Shiraz and to encourage resistance against Mongol authority. In 1264, Khafaja representatives brought reports from Iraq and Persia. They claimed that their tribesmen had raided near Basra and Baghdad and that the ruler of Shiraz had defeated a Mongol force. The information was only partly accurate. The ruler of Shiraz had indeed resisted Mongol officials, but he was eventually defeated. The refugees who later arrived from the city were probably a direct consequence of that failure. Even inaccurate information could influence policy. Baybars responded by encouraging the ruler and sending further messages into the region. The Khafaja also assisted military refugees fleeing towards Syria. They helped guide Jalal al-Din Yashkar and his followers through Iraq and away from Mongol control. Over time, however, relations deteriorated. Later, Mamluk forces fought Khafaja groups near Anbar and the Euphrates. The change demonstrated the unstable nature of tribal alliances. The Mongols gradually became aware that Baybars' agents were operating inside their territories. Messengers linked to former regional rulers were captured and accused of espionage. A Muslim scholar in Mosul may have been executed for the same reason. In Cilicia, a group of Muslim mendicants traveling to a tomb near Tarsus was arrested because King Leon suspected that Baybars himself might be hiding among them. The story was probably exaggerated, but it reveals the reputation Baybars had acquired. His speed, secrecy, and unpredictable movements made enemies believe he might appear anywhere in disguise. A Persian chronicler later told an even more extraordinary story. According to this account, Baybars secretly entered Seljuk Anatolia with only a few companions, examined its roads and armies, and left his ring in a shop as proof of his journey. He then challenged Abaka to retrieve and return it. The story is almost certainly legendary, yet legends often grow around genuine fears. The Mongols knew that Mamluk agents had penetrated their territory, and popular imagination transformed those operations into the personal adventures of Baybars. Later evidence confirms that Mamluk agents sometimes disguised themselves as wandering religious men. An Ilkhan complained that a spy dressed as a fakir had been captured by a Mongol patrol. He claimed that many other mendicants had been killed because soldiers suspected them of espionage. The Mamluk response did not deny the accusation. Instead, it accused the Mongols of using similar methods. Intelligence gathering was only the beginning of Baybars' secret war. He also employed methods designed to destroy enemies without fighting them directly. Assassination was the most obvious technique. Baybars successfully arranged the killing of Philip of Montfort, although an attempt against Prince Edward of England failed. He also sent assassins after a Frankish lord who had fled to the Mongols and was requesting military aid. Mamluk reports claimed that the man was killed, but he later reappeared alive, showing that the mission had failed or the report was false. Other assassination stories are even less credible. One account describes Baybars recruiting 3 Kurdish warriors to enter Mongol territory and kill 3 princes. They supposedly completed the mission before being killed themselves. The absence of confirmation from other sources makes this story highly doubtful. Disinformation was far more sophisticated and potentially more effective. Instead of killing an enemy directly, Baybars could make the Ilkhan believe that the man was secretly working for the Mamluks. One target was Zayn al-Din al-Hafizi, a former Ayyubid minister who had supported the Mongols and fled with them after Ain Jalut. Baybars had personal reasons to hate him, but the man was also an experienced official serving the Ilkhanate. Baybars sent false messages that created the impression of a secret relationship between them. The official showed the letters to Hulegu and initially convinced him of his innocence. Baybars then sent another, even more damaging message and arranged for it to fall into Mongol hands. This time, Hulegu refused to accept any explanation. The official and his family were executed. The operation required no army and no assassin. Baybars destroyed an enemy simply by manipulating the Ilkhan's suspicion. A similar plan was reportedly used against an influential Christian leader in Baghdad. Baybars composed a letter thanking him for secretly providing information about Mongol affairs. The letter was intentionally allowed to fall into Ilkhanid hands. The man was then accused of treason and may have been executed, although problems in the chronology make the story uncertain. Whether or not the operation succeeded exactly as described, the technique is clear. Baybars understood that the Mongol court was already suspicious of its Muslim and Christian officials. A carefully planted letter could turn that suspicion into violence. This atmosphere benefited the Mamluks. The more the Ilkhans doubted their own servants, the weaker their administration became. Baybars also used deception to force hesitant allies to flee. A former Abbasid officer named Salah had promised to defect but repeatedly delayed his departure. Baybars sent 2 secret couriers carrying a message to him. One agent had orders to kill the other and leave the body and letter where Mongol officials would discover them. Once the communication was exposed, Salah could no longer safely remain in Mongol service. He fled to the Mamluk Sultanate, where Baybars welcomed him warmly. The method was ruthless. Baybars sacrificed one of his own operatives to remove Salah's freedom of choice. Not every secret negotiation succeeded. Baybars corresponded with the Ayyubid ruler of Hisan Kaifa and encouraged him to abandon Mongol authority. The ruler agreed under the influence of 2 trusted servants. The returning Mamluk couriers were captured, however, and their letters were delivered to Abaka. The 2 servants were executed. The ruler was spared but forced to live under supervision at the Mongol court for several years. Baybars also maintained contact with the Christian rulers of Georgia. Georgian princes expressed friendship toward the Mamluk Sultan and hostility toward the Ilkhans. Some claimed to be communicating with the Golden Horde as well. Yet Georgia remained too firmly under Mongol domination to become a reliable ally. Georgian troops continued fighting beside Mongol armies in later campaigns. Baybars probably understood this. He may never have expected the Georgian kings to openly revolt. But secret contact still served a purpose. It forced the Mongols to question the loyalty of their Georgian subjects, created tension behind Ilkhanid lines, and cost Baybars very little. This was the essence of his secret war. Every rumor, hidden letter, frightened official, uncertain governor, and suspected betrayal weakened the enemy. Baybars did not need every plot to succeed. He only needed the Mongols to believe that plots might exist everywhere. His intelligence system gave him warning of danger. His propaganda created distrust. His agents encouraged defection. His secret correspondence turned local rulers into potential rebels. And his disinformation persuaded the Ilkhans to destroy some of their own servants. The Mongol-Mamluk conflict was therefore fought on 2 levels. Along the Euphrates, armies contested fortresses and river crossings. Behind the frontier, invisible networks fought over information, loyalty, and fear. Baybars proved exceptionally skilled in both worlds. After the Battle of Ain Jalut, the conflict between the Mamluk Sultanate and the Ilkhanate evolved into a prolonged border war rather than a series of decisive battles. Baybars understood that defeating the Mongols required far more than victories on the battlefield. He strengthened frontier fortresses, maintained constant military readiness, launched frequent raids across the Euphrates, and developed an extensive intelligence network that allowed him to monitor enemy movements long before major invasions could begin. The fortress of Al-Bira became the centerpiece of this frontier system. The Mongols repeatedly attempted to capture it in order to establish a bridgehead into Syria, but every major siege ended in failure. Whenever reports reached Baybars that a Mongol army was approaching, he reacted with remarkable speed, gathering his forces, reinforcing the garrison, and personally marching north. The defenders consistently held their ground until relief arrived, forcing the Mongols to abandon their siege engines and retreat. Following each victory, Baybars strengthened the fortress even further by repairing its defenses, expanding its supplies, and rewarding both soldiers and civilians for their determination. While the Mongols struggled to make progress along the frontier, Baybars seized every opportunity to strike at their allies. The Kingdom of Cilician Armenia, which had closely aligned itself with the Ilkhanids, became a primary target. Repeated Mamluk campaigns devastated Armenian territory, capturing major cities, destroying settlements, and taking thousands of prisoners. King Hetum was ultimately forced into negotiations after the capture of his son Leon. Baybars demanded not only Leon's ransom, but also the return of strategic fortresses and the release of his trusted commander Sunkur al-Ashkar from Mongol captivity. The agreement represented both a military and diplomatic triumph for the Mamluk Sultan. Whenever the Mongol threat temporarily subsided, Baybars redirected his attention toward the Crusader states. During these years, he systematically dismantled Frankish power by capturing or destroying important coastal cities and castles, including Caesarea, Arsuf, Saft, Crac des Chevaliers, and Antioch. His strategy was simple, but effective. Eliminate every potential ally the Mongols might rely upon before another major invasion could be launched. Diplomatic relations between Baybars and the Ilkhan rulers never produced meaningful results despite the frequent exchange of embassies. The two sides understood peace in completely different ways. For Abaga, peace meant the Mamluks accepting Mongol supremacy and submitting to the Great Khan's authority. Baybars categorically rejected such demands, insisting instead that the Mongols abandon the Muslim lands they occupied. As a result, diplomatic missions became little more than opportunities for intimidation, propaganda, and psychological warfare rather than genuine negotiations. One of Baybars's greatest strengths was his intelligence service. Secret agents, couriers, merchants, and local informants constantly traveled through Mongol territory, supplying the Sultan with valuable military information. Baybars often knew about enemy mobilizations before the armies themselves had crossed the frontier, allowing him to prepare his defenses in advance. His covert operations extended beyond espionage and included disinformation campaigns, assassination plots, and secret contacts with Muslim officials serving under Mongol rule, encouraging defections and undermining Ilkhanid authority from within. The Mongols attempted to conduct their own intelligence operations, but they achieved far less success. Several of their spies were discovered, arrested, and executed before they could gather useful information. At the same time, Baybars actively welcomed defectors from the Ilkhanate, including Mongol officers, Muslim commanders, and former officials of the Abbasid Caliphate. These refugees were integrated into the Mamluk army, strengthening the Sultan's military while simultaneously depriving the Ilkhanids of experienced personnel. Baybars also became increasingly involved in the politics of Seljuk Anatolia. Secret correspondence with influential figures such as the Pervane encouraged him to intervene against Mongol influence in the region. Although these contacts did not immediately produce military action, they laid the foundation for Baybars' later campaign into Anatolia and deepened the growing mistrust between the Ilkhanid rulers and their own regional governors. Overall, this period was defined not by massive pitched battles, but by constant military pressure, fortified frontiers, intelligence operations, diplomatic maneuvering, and calculated raids. The Mamluks viewed every border clash as a struggle for the survival of their state, while the Ilkhanids considered the Syrian frontier only one theater among many. This difference in priorities largely explains why Mamluk chroniclers recorded these campaigns in great detail, whereas Mongol sources devoted comparatively little attention to the same conflict. Baybars' intervention in Seljuk Rum was the culmination of years of secret diplomacy, intelligence gathering, and political intrigue. After repeated Mongol failures on the Syrian frontier, several Seljuk governors and military commanders secretly contacted Baybars, promising support if he invaded Anatolia and helped overthrow Mongol domination. The influential Pervane also maintained covert communications with the Mamluk Sultan, although his loyalty constantly shifted according to political circumstances. Before launching his invasion, Baybars strengthened his position by accepting defectors from the Ilkhanate, conducting reconnaissance raids across the frontier, and encouraging anti-Mongol resistance among the Turkmen and discontented Seljuk officials. However, many of the conspirators were eventually discovered. Several were executed by the Mongols, while others escaped to Egypt, further convincing Baybars that direct intervention could not be delayed much longer. In early 1277, Baybars marched from Cairo with the majority of the Egyptian and Syrian armies, crossed the Taurus Mountains, and advanced toward the plain of Abulistain. The Mongol commanders, supported by Georgian and Seljuk contingents, attempted to block his advance. During the Battle of Abulistain, the Mongols initially broke through sections of the Mamluk line, but Baybars personally stabilized the army and organized a powerful counterattack. The Mongol forces eventually collapsed after fierce fighting, suffering thousands of casualties, while the Mamluks secured one of their greatest victories over the Ilkhanids. Following the victory, Baybars entered the Seljuk capital of Kayseri, where he was welcomed by the local population and symbolically asserted his authority by ordering coins to be struck in his name. Despite this success, he quickly realized that his political allies were unreliable. The Pervane delayed joining him, hoping instead to keep Baybars in Anatolia until a Baga arrived with a larger Mongol army. Recognizing the growing danger, shortages of supplies, and the impossibility of permanently occupying Rum, Baybars withdrew his army and returned safely to Syria after encouraging continued Turkmen resistance against Mongol rule. Abaga reached Anatolia soon after the Mamluk withdrawal and reacted with fury. He ordered massacres in parts of eastern Anatolia, restored Mongol control over the region, suppressed local revolts, and eventually executed the Pervane after overwhelming evidence revealed his secret cooperation with Baybars. Although the Mamluks did not permanently conquer Anatolia, the campaign demonstrated that the Ilkhanids were vulnerable, severely damaged Mongol prestige, inspired further resistance among the Turkmen, and represented the greatest Mamluk military success outside Syria during Baybars' reign. After Baybars' death in 1277, the Mamluk Sultanate entered a period of political instability as rival factions competed for power. Qalawun eventually secured the throne, suppressed internal rebellions, and restored unity within the military elite. One of the most serious challenges came from the rebel Amir Sunkur al-Ashkar, whose contacts with the Ilkhanids encouraged Abaga Khan to exploit the Mamluks' internal divisions and prepare a major invasion of Syria. The Mongols invaded northern Syria in 1280, devastating the countryside and briefly occupying Aleppo before withdrawing. Anticipating another, larger campaign, Qalawun relied heavily on the intelligence network established by Baybars. Spies, secret couriers, scouts, and captured Mongol officers supplied detailed information on enemy movements, allowing the Mamluks to mobilize their forces, reconcile with former rivals such as Sunkur al-Ashkar, and secure truces with the Crusader states to avoid fighting on multiple fronts. In 1281, Abaga launched his largest offensive against Syria, sending a multinational army of Mongols, Armenians, Georgians, Seljuk troops, and other allies under Mengu Temur. Thanks to timely intelligence, Qalawun assembled a well-prepared army near Homs, reinforced vulnerable sectors of his battle line, and coordinated Mamluk, Bedouin, Turkmen, and Syrian forces into a unified defensive formation. The sources emphasize that Baybars' military reforms and intelligence system played a decisive role in enabling the Mamluks to confront the Mongol invasion successfully. After Baybars defeated the Mongols at Ain Jalut and secured the Mamluk Sultanate, the struggle with the Ilkhanids entered a new phase. Instead of launching constant full-scale invasions, both sides fought a prolonged border war centered on the Euphrates frontier. The Mongols repeatedly attempted to capture the key frontier fortress of Albira, knowing that its fall would open the road into northern Syria. Baybars reacted with remarkable speed whenever news of an invasion reached him. He personally led relief armies, reinforced frontier garrisons, ensured that castles were heavily supplied, and maintained rapid communication through mounted couriers and carrier pigeons. On several occasions, Mongol armies abandoned their sieges simply because they learned that Baybars himself was approaching with reinforcements. The defense of Albira became one of the defining successes of Mamluk frontier strategy, preventing the Ilkhanids from establishing a permanent bridgehead west of the Euphrates. At the same time, Baybars refused to remain on the defensive. He organized frequent raids across the Euphrates into Mongol-held territory, targeting garrisons, supply centers, and frontier settlements. These expeditions gathered intelligence, disrupted enemy communications, destroyed supplies, and forced the Mongols to keep large forces guarding their own borders. Baybars also launched repeated invasions of Cilician Armenia, whose rulers remained loyal allies of the Ilkhans. Major campaigns devastated Sis, Tarsus, Adana, Ayas, and other Armenian strongholds, capturing thousands of prisoners, destroying towns, and weakening Armenia's ability to support future Mongol offensives. Through diplomacy, military pressure, and hostage exchanges, Baybars even forced King Hetum to surrender several strategic fortresses and secured the release of his trusted commander, Sunkur al-Ashkar, from Mongol captivity. These victories significantly strengthened the Mamluk northern frontier while isolating the Mongols from one of their most dependable allies. Military strength alone did not explain Baybar's success. He built one of the most effective intelligence networks in the medieval Islamic world. Professional agents constantly traveled through Iraq, Anatolia, Armenia, Persia, and Mongol territory, disguised as merchants, travelers, or messengers. They reported troop movements, political disputes, military preparations, and diplomatic developments directly to the Sultan. Baybars paid these agents generously because they risked their lives behind enemy lines. His intelligence service frequently warned him weeks before Mongol invasions began, allowing him to mobilize armies long before the enemy reached Syria. The same network also spread misinformation, cultivated allies among Muslim rulers under Mongol control, organized defections, and maintained secret contacts with dissatisfied Mongol commanders. In addition, specialized operatives burned grazing lands, disrupted supply routes, and conducted covert sabotage to slow Mongol armies before they even reached the frontier. These intelligence operations became a cornerstone of Mamluk strategy and continued long after Baybar's death. After Baybars died in 1277, Sultan Qalawun inherited both the frontier system and the intelligence network. He quickly faced the greatest Mongol invasion since Ayn Jalut. Ilkhan Abaga assembled a huge coalition army composed of Mongols, Armenians, Georgians, Seljuk forces, and numerous auxiliary troops under the command of his brother Mengu Temur. Mamluk intelligence accurately reported the size of the invading army and its planned route into Syria. Qalawun responded by concentrating nearly the entire military strength of the Sultanate while simultaneously maintaining truces with the Crusader states to avoid fighting on two fronts. The Mamluks carefully prepared defensive positions near Homs, where they intended to force the Mongols into a decisive battle under favorable conditions. The Second Battle of Homs, fought in October 1281, was one of the largest confrontations of the entire Mongol-Mamluk conflict. The Mongol right wing achieved an impressive breakthrough, crushing the Mamluk left and pursuing fleeing troops far from the battlefield. Many believed the battle had already been won. However, the Mamluk right wing successfully resisted repeated attacks before launching a determined counteroffensive against the Mongol left. During the fighting, Mengu Temur was wounded, throwing the Mongol center into confusion. Leadership broke down at the critical moment, and coordination between the different Mongol wings collapsed completely. The victorious Mongol right, unaware that the center had been defeated, continued pursuing fleeing enemies instead of supporting the rest of the army. By the time they realized what had happened, the battle had already been lost. The Mongol retreat rapidly turned into a disaster. Pursued relentlessly by Mamluk cavalry, Bedouin tribes, frontier garrisons, and local populations, thousands of soldiers were killed while attempting to escape across the Syrian desert and the Euphrates. Many drowned during river crossings, while others were trapped in marshes or killed by local defenders. According to the contemporary sources, more Mongols died during the retreat than on the battlefield itself. Abaga was furious when he learned of the defeat and immediately planned another invasion, but his death in 1282 prevented any renewed offensive. As a result, Syria remained secure from another major Ilkhanid invasion for almost 20 years. The frontier system established by Baybars proved to be one of the decisive reasons for Mamluk survival. Strongholds such as Al-Bira and Al-Rahba guarded the Euphrates crossings, served as early warning stations, housed large garrisons, and acted as bases for reconnaissance and cross-border raids. Bedouin allies patrolled the frontier and provided constant intelligence about enemy movements, while annual military patrols reinforced vulnerable northern districts. Rapid communication through mounted couriers, pigeon post, and signal fires ensured that Cairo and Damascus learned of invasions almost immediately. Instead of relying on static defenses alone, the Mamluks combined fortifications, mobile field armies, intelligence gathering, sabotage, diplomacy, and offensive raids into a highly flexible defense system. This strategy denied the Mongols any permanent foothold west of the Euphrates despite nearly 2 decades of repeated attacks. The contrast between the two sides became increasingly clear. For the Mamluks, every campaign was a struggle for the survival of their state, their religion, and their homeland, creating exceptional determination among commanders and soldiers alike. For the Ilkhans, however, Syria represented only one frontier among several, competing with wars against the Golden Horde and the Chagatai Khanate. Consequently, while Mongol defeats in Syria were embarrassing, they never threatened the existence of the Ilkhanid state itself. This difference in strategic priorities explains why Mamluk chroniclers recorded the frontier war in extraordinary detail, whereas Persian historians devoted comparatively little attention to the continuous fighting along the Euphrates. Ultimately, Baybar's combination of military reforms, intelligence operations, frontier fortifications, rapid mobilization, and aggressive counteroffensives created a defensive system that successfully contained Mongol expansion into Syria and preserved the Mamluk Sultanate for generations. The Mongol frontier was organized very differently from the Mamluk defense system. Unlike the Mamluks, who relied on major frontier fortresses such as Al-Bira and Al-Raba, the Mongols maintained only small garrisons along the Euphrates. Large Mongol armies appeared only during major offensives, leaving much of the Jazira lightly defended. This allowed Mamluk scouts and raiding parties to cross the frontier with surprising freedom, while repeated Mamluk campaigns eventually discouraged Armenian resistance along the border. Many towns under Mongol rule, including Al-Raqqa, Edessa, Saruj, Harran, and other settlements, fell into decline or were abandoned after years of warfare and destruction, leading to agricultural collapse and population loss. Despite continuous warfare, the frontier was never completely closed. Trade continued on a limited scale, although it became more dangerous and less regular. Baybars welcomed imports that strengthened the Mamluk military, especially horses and military slaves, while the Ilkhanids generally discouraged commerce with their enemies. Armenian ports such as Ayas became important commercial hubs linking the Ilkhanid world with the Mediterranean, and some merchants still reached Egypt through Cilicia or by sea. Contemporary evidence suggests that commerce survived because profits remained high despite the constant military danger, official restrictions, and the widespread fear that merchants might actually be enemy spies. Civilian movement across the frontier also continued, although on a much smaller scale than before the wars. Military refugees, scholars, religious figures, and civilians occasionally crossed from Mongol territory into the Mamluk Sultanate. One of the most important forms of peaceful contact was the Iraqi pilgrimage caravan to Mecca, which resumed under Mongol rule. Baybars permitted these caravans because, as protector of the holy cities, he wished to preserve his prestige throughout the Islamic world. At the same time, these pilgrimages offered opportunities for both sides to gather intelligence and establish political contacts. Pilgrims from Anatolia, Iraq, Iran, Georgia, Armenia, and other eastern regions also continued to travel through Syria despite the ongoing conflict, demonstrating that the frontier remained porous even during decades of war. The Mongol army remained based on highly mobile mounted archers. Each warrior usually rode with several horses, allowing rapid movement throughout a campaign. Their preferred tactic was to wear down the enemy through repeated waves of mounted archery, flanking maneuvers, and feigned retreats before delivering a decisive attack. However, previous scholars underestimated Mongol equipment. By the late 13th century, the Ilkhanids ruled wealthy urban regions capable of producing high-quality weapons and armor, while Mongol troops increasingly used swords, maces, helmets, shields, and improved horses alongside their famous bows. Their military system therefore evolved considerably after settling in the Middle East. The Mamluk army was equally formidable but operated differently. Its soldiers underwent years of rigorous professional training, especially in mounted archery, swordsmanship, lance fighting, and coordinated cavalry maneuvers. Mamluk cavalry generally rode larger and stronger horses and carried a wider variety of weapons than their Mongol opponents. Nevertheless, cautions against viewing every Mamluk soldier as an elite warrior. only the Sultan's personal Mamluks received the highest standard of instruction, while many other troops consisted of provincial Mamluks, free cavalrymen, Kurds, refugee soldiers, and even former Mongols. As a result, the overall quality of the army varied considerably. The evidence suggests that the two armies were far more evenly matched than often assumed. Although individual royal Mamluks may have surpassed the average Mongol in training, the Mongols possessed advantages in operational coordination, battlefield mobility, and experience conducting large-scale maneuvers. Baybars himself openly acknowledged the danger posed by relatively small Mongol forces, demonstrating that the Mamluks never underestimated their enemy. Their constant mobilizations, expansion of frontier fortifications, and investment in intelligence networks reflected genuine respect for Mongol military power rather than confidence in automatic superiority. The Mongols failed to conquer Syria not because they lacked military strength or because logistical difficulties alone prevented victory, but because the Mamluks consistently proved more effective in organization, strategy, and defense. Baybars built a highly efficient military system based on rapid mobilization, strong frontier fortresses, an extensive intelligence network, and continuous pressure against the enemy. At the same time, the Ilkhanids were forced to divide their military resources between Syria and wars against rival Mongol states, while repeated attempts to secure military cooperation from Western Europe produced little practical support. Although the Mongols remained determined to conquer Syria and repeatedly launched invasions over several decades, the Mamluks successfully defended their frontier, preserved their state, and permanently halted Mongol expansion